Before we begin tonight, a quick and sincere thank you to Scott B for suggesting this episode. If you are enjoying Sleep Theories, please take 10 seconds to leave a review on Spotify. It genuinely helps the channel more than almost anything else, and it means the world to this little community we're building together. Alright, let us get into it. Tonight, we're going somewhere that a lot of people know by name, but very few people truly understand. A place that holds the beauty of a wide, glittering southern lake, the kind you might see on a postcard, with sailboats cutting through golden afternoon light, and families gathered on docks eating watermelon in the heat of a Georgia summer. A place that, on the surface, looks like nothing more than a beloved recreational landmark. But beneath that surface, the story is entirely different. We're going to Lake Lanier, and tonight, we are not going to talk about it the way most people do. We are not going to recite the list of drownings and the body count that gets passed around in forum threads like a campfire ghost story. We are not going to talk about the submerged town of Oscarville as though it were a haunted place, full of restless spirits pulling swimmers down into the cold dark. We are going to talk about something quieter than a ghost, something older than folklore, something that does not require the supernatural to be genuinely terrifying. We are going to talk about the current beneath Lanier, not the one you can see, the one you cannot. Close your eyes for a moment if it is safe to do so. Picture water at 4 in the morning, the kind of stillness that feels almost theatrical, like the lake is holding its breath. There is no wind. The surface is a mirror. You can see the faint outline of the Georgia hills on the far bank, dark against a sky that has not quite decided whether it belongs to night or morning. Now picture yourself standing at the edge of a dock. You are an experienced boater. You have been on this lake 100 times. You know these waters. You know the hidden drop-offs, the submerged timber zones, the shallow flats where the bass like to feed near sundown. You know Lake Lanier the way you know a familiar road. You step onto your boat, you check the gauges, everything reads normal. You push off into the dark water, and for a few seconds, everything is fine. Then your compass spins. Not a gradual drift, a spin. 11 degrees east in less than a second, then back to centre, then east again, then still. Your radio cuts out. Not static, not interference. Silence, then a burst of something that might be a voice, then silence again. Your depth finder, which should be reading somewhere around 40 feet of water, flashes a reading of 312 feet, then 0, then 40 again. You look up at the shoreline to get your bearings, and for just a moment, just a single moment, the shoreline looks farther away than it should. You blink, you look again. It is fine. Everything is fine. The shore is right where it is supposed to be. But something happened in that moment. Something small. Something you cannot explain. And you're not the first person to feel it. Not even close. The first time you hear someone describe something like this, you assume it is exaggeration. Maybe they had a few drinks. Maybe they were tired. Maybe the equipment was old. These things happen on the water, especially on a large, crowded, geologically complex reservoir like Lake Lanier. There are 1,000 mundane explanations for a compass drift or a radio hiccup, and most of the time one of those explanations is correct. But what happens when the reports start stacking up? What happens when you notice that the strange readings are not random? What happens when you map them and the map starts to tell a story you were not expecting? That is the question that Dr. Malcolm Reeves found himself asking. Roughly 4 years into what he thought was going to be a fairly routine academic study of electromagnetic interference patterns near large artificial reservoirs in the American South. Reeves is a geophysicist, a fictional one as we build this narrative tonight, but constructed from a very real body of research that exists in geophysical literature about buried infrastructure, mineral-rich floodplains, and the measurable electromagnetic consequences of large-scale human alteration to landscape. His field is dry, methodical, and not particularly glamorous. He does not hunt for ghosts. He does not believe in curses. He believes in data. And the data, when it finally started to come together, terrified him. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what Reeves found, you first have to understand what Lake Lanier actually is, not what it looks like, not what it feels like on a warm Saturday afternoon when the ski boats are out and the shoreline restaurants are packed, and the whole place looks like a celebration of everything good about summer in the American South. What it actually is. Lake Lanier is a reservoir. It is not a natural lake. It was created deliberately, by design, by flooding. In the early 1950s, the United States Army Corps of Engineers constructed Buford Dam on the Chattahoochee River in northern Georgia, and when that dam was finished, the water behind it began to rise, slowly at first, then faster, and as the water rose, it swallowed everything in its path. Roads disappeared beneath the surface. Farmhouses went under, churches were inundated. Cemeteries, some relocated and some reportedly not, were submerged beneath what would eventually become a 38,000-acre lake sitting at the edge of the Atlanta metropolitan area. The lake was finished in 1956. Within a few decades, it had become one of the most visited reservoirs in the United States. Millions of people a year, boat rentals, lakefront homes, resorts, state parks, and a death toll that, by the early 2000s, was making national headlines. More than 700 people have died in Lake Lanier since the reservoir was completed. That number puts it in conversations about the most dangerous lakes in America, a reputation that the state of Georgia and the Army Corps of Engineers have consistently pushed back against, arguing that the sheer volume of visitors explains the statistics. When you put millions of people on the water every year, some of them are going to die. That is mathematics, not mystery. And they are not wrong. Much of what makes Lake Lanier deadly is tragically ordinary. Boat collisions, alcohol, non-swimmers who overestimate their abilities, the submerged debris, trees, foundations, old road surfaces that can snag a propeller or trap a diver in the dark. These are real dangers, documented dangers. But the deaths that do not fit neatly into those categories are harder to dismiss. The experienced swimmers who panic in calm water, the boaters with perfect visibility and no alcohol in their system who lose their sense of direction in the middle of a lake they have been navigating for years. The divers who report that their sense of which way is up simply vanishes at certain depths in certain zones. The anglers who describe moments of sudden, inexplicable disorientation, so intense they have to grab the side of the boat just to steady themselves. These are the cases that caught Reeves's attention, and they were not scattered randomly across the lake, they clustered. Reeves began his work the way any good researcher does. He started with public records, accident reports filed with the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, Coast Guard incident logs, news archives. He read hundreds of accounts, not looking for the supernatural but looking for patterns in the mundane details. The time of day, the weather conditions, the location on the lake, the type of vessel or activity. And a pattern emerged. Not everywhere, not with every accident, but in enough cases to be statistically interesting, and in a geographic distribution that was too specific to be coincidental. The strange details, the compass anomalies, the electronics failures, the disorientation, the sudden panic, appeared to cluster near specific underwater zones. Zones that corresponded, when Reeves overlaid his incident maps with old survey data from before the reservoir was filled, to the locations of former roads, former buildings, former infrastructure, the old bones of the world beneath the water. Now, before we go any further, it is worth pausing to explain why this might matter. Why would submerged roads and old foundations create any kind of electromagnetic anomaly? The answer, as Reeves understood it, has to do with a combination of factors that most people do not think about when they think about water. First, there is the geology. Northern Georgia's soil is extraordinarily rich in iron and magnetite, naturally occurring minerals that are essentially buried magnets. Iron in soil does not typically do anything dramatic, but iron in large concentrations, especially when that iron is wet, can create subtle, localized distortions in the Earth's magnetic field. Not dramatic ones, not the kind you would notice standing in a field, but potentially enough, under the right conditions, to affect sensitive instruments. Second, there is the submerged infrastructure. When the land beneath Lake Lanier was flooded, it was not cleared completely. Some structures were demolished, some were left. Buried pipes, old electrical lines, metal fencing, farm equipment, automobile parts, all of it went under the water. And metal, when submerged in the right kind of water with the right mineral content, does interesting things over decades. It corrodes, it creates small electrochemical reactions. In some cases it generates weak electrical currents through a process called galvanic corrosion. Nothing powerful, nothing that would shock you, but measurable if you had the right instruments. Third, and this is where Reeves's thinking started to become genuinely unsettling, there is the question of what the land had been used for in the years immediately before the reservoir filled. because it turns out the land that became Lake Lanier had attracted a particular kind of federal attention in the early 1950s, and that attention was not publicly documented in the way that most government infrastructure projects are. Let us talk about Oscarville. The name comes up in almost every serious discussion of Lake Lanier's dark history, usually in the context of racial injustice. In 1912, a series of horrific events in Forsyth County, Georgia, led to the violent expulsion of virtually the entire black population of the county. Oscarville was one of the communities destroyed in that violence. The story of what happened there is one of the most disturbing chapters in Georgia's history, and it is a chapter that the flooding of Lake Lanier literally buried beneath 30 feet of water. Reeves was not approaching Oscarville as a haunted place. He was approaching it as a historical site with specific geological and structural characteristics. The community had been established on iron-rich soil. The farms there had used extensive metal irrigation equipment. There had been a modest power infrastructure serving the area in the early 20th century, and the documentation of exactly what was removed from the land before flooding and what was not was incomplete. Reeves filed public records requests with the Army Corps of Engineers. What he received was thorough for the most part. The engineering documentation for Buford Dam itself was exhaustive. The geological surveys of the reservoir basin were detailed. The records of how many homes were demolished, how many graves were relocated, how many miles of road were removed, all of it was accounted for more or less. But one document was missing, a 1956 subsurface hazard survey, referenced in an index, cited in a footnote of another report, but not present in the public file. When Reeves asked about it, he was told the document had been pulled from the public archive because it contained sensitive infrastructure information, relevant to national security classifications that had never been formally lifted. A retired clerk who had worked in the Corps of Engineers archive for over 3 decades told him, off the record, that the document had been sealed not long after it was completed, and that it had something to do with readings taken beneath the future waterline in the months immediately before the reservoir was filled. Abnormal readings. Reeves spent the next several months trying to locate a copy of that survey through other channels. What he eventually found, a partial copy, obtained through an academic colleague who had worked in a related field, was fragmentary and heavily redacted, but it contained enough. The survey mentioned, in clinical and unemotional language, several areas along the Chattahoochee floodplain where subsurface readings had come back unusual. The language used was anomalous magnetic flux patterns consistent with buried conductive material of unknown origin. The survey flagged several of these areas as warranting further investigation. It recommended a follow-up study before the reservoir was filled. There was no evidence that the follow-up study had ever been completed, or if it had, its results had never been made public. And beneath the clinical language about magnetic flux and conductive material was a detail that Reeves almost missed on his first reading. The survey noted that several of the anomalous readings were not consistent with natural geological features or typical construction debris. They were consistent with buried linear structures, in plain language, things that had been placed there deliberately, in a line, with some kind of purpose. Reeves brought a research team to Lake Lanier on a Tuesday morning in early November, when the boat traffic was minimal and the water was cold enough that casual recreation had wound down for the season. They were running what he described to the marina as a routine water quality study. He had the paperwork to back it up. What they were actually doing was running a full electromagnetic survey of the lake bottom in the areas that corresponded to the anomalous zones from the old core survey. The team used marine magnetometers, instruments designed to detect variations in the Earth's magnetic field that might indicate buried ferrous material. They had a sonar rig for bottom mapping. They had underwater drones equipped with cameras and conductivity sensors, and they had a full array of standard compasses mounted at different points on the vessel, which served as a simple, analogue check on the more sophisticated instruments. For the first 2 hours, the data was unremarkable. Lake Lanier's bottom is messy. There is debris everywhere. Metal readings came back in clusters near the obvious spots. Old road crossings, known areas where structure had been cleared but not completely removed. The sonar showed the kind of chaotic layered bottom that you would expect from 50 years of sediment accumulation over flooded infrastructure. Nothing unusual, nothing that would make anyone suspicious. Then they moved into the zone. The specific location is not named in Reeves's notes for reasons that will become clear, but it corresponds to an area roughly midway across the lake. where an old county road had once crossed a low ridge before being submerged by the rising waters of the reservoir. The depth there is approximately 38 feet. The bottom, according to the old construction maps, should have been cleared of surface structures before flooding. Nothing should be down there except the original terrain and whatever sediment has accumulated since. The first thing that changed was the compass array. 2 of the 4 mounted compasses shifted simultaneously, not by a lot, 11 degrees to the east. It lasted for approximately 11 seconds, then they corrected. The magnetometer spiked. The underwater drone, which had been running steadily, lost signal for approximately 8 seconds before rebooting and resuming its feed, and the sonar, the piece of data that stopped Reeves cold, showed something beneath the silt layer that should not have been there. A line. A straight line running northeast to southwest, approximately 2 meters beneath the current lakebed surface. Not a pipe, based on the sonar signature, not a cable. Something wider than a cable. Something that read like a series of objects spaced evenly, creating a linear feature that extended for at least 60 meters in either direction, before disappearing beyond the sonar's effective range. Too straight for geology, too regular for debris. The drone footage, when they reviewed it later, showed the edge of the feature where it came closest to the current silt surface. The silt had shifted slightly in that area, possibly from water movement or current dynamics, and beneath the silt, half buried and half exposed, were the tops of what appeared to be metal pylons. Dark metal, heavy, set into the original lake bed at regular intervals. Not natural, not accidental, placed there. Now there is a temptation at this point in the story to leap to conclusions, to say that what Reeves found was proof of something vast and sinister, a secret grid, a government conspiracy, a deliberate attempt to do something to the people who would eventually use the lake. And in the version of this story that circulates in online forums, that is exactly what people claim. Some go further, describing elaborate underground facilities and real-time control systems and active surveillance networks beneath the water. But Reeves was a scientist, and the version of the story that he believed was more precise than that, and ultimately more disturbing. Because it did not require anyone to be actively malevolent. It only required something to have been left behind and forgotten. Before Lake Lanier was filled, the area of northern Georgia that would become the reservoir's basin was not merely farmland and small communities. In the early 1950s, with the Cold War entering its most anxious and inventive phase, federal interest in the American Southeast had expanded significantly. Civil defense planning was underway across the country. The federal government was deeply concerned with how communications would continue to function in the aftermath of a nuclear attack. Underground systems, buried infrastructure, signal routing that could survive a surface strike. The Chattahoochee River Valley had been identified in the late 1940s as a potential corridor for such planning, partly because of its geography, and partly because the large dam project that was already underway gave federal agencies a convenient cover under which they could conduct experiments without attracting scrutiny. The theory that Reeves eventually settled on was this. In the period between roughly 1952 and 1955, while Buford Dam was under construction and the future reservoir basin was still accessible, a secondary infrastructure project was conducted beneath the cover of the dam construction. This project involved the installation of a buried signal network, a series of conductive pylons and connecting materials designed to test the feasibility of low-frequency electromagnetic transmission through wet earth and water. The technology was based on early research into extremely low-frequency communications, a field that would later be used by the United States Navy to communicate with submerged submarines. The system was experimental. It was not intended to be permanent in an operational sense. The plan, as best Reeves could reconstruct it, was to study the network's behaviour as the reservoir filled, gathering data on how water and soil saturation affected signal transmission through buried conductors, and then to decommission the system before the lake was open to the public. But the decommissioning never happened, or if it did, it was incomplete. The pylons that Reeves's drone found were still there. The connecting material between them, whatever it had been made of, had corroded significantly in the decades of submersion. But the decay process itself had not neutralized the system. It had transformed it. Corroding metal in mineral-rich water does not simply stop conducting. It changes the way it conducts. It creates unpredictable electrochemical behavior. It generates small fields, variable ones, fields that activate and subside depending on conditions that are not easy to control or predict. Temperature, water pressure, the conductivity of the water itself, which varies dramatically after heavy rainfall, the electrical load from nearby power infrastructure, because Lake Lanier sits in the path of significant regional power transmission lines, and the electromagnetic environment around large power lines affects buried conductive systems in complex ways. Under ordinary conditions, the network is dormant. The fields it produces are too weak to measure with consumer-grade instruments. Nothing happens. But under specific conditions, heavy rainfall, high water conductivity, certain seasonal temperature patterns, certain patterns of regional power draw, specific zones of the network briefly activate. They produce localized disturbances, small ones, measured in fractions of a Tesla, lasting for seconds. Seconds are enough. Because here is the part of Reeves's theory that does not require any of the electromagnetic physics to be remarkable. Here is the part that has to do with human biology. The inner ear contains structures called the semicircular canals and the otolith organs. Together they form the vestibular system, which is the primary system your body uses to determine your orientation in space. Balance, in other words, the sense of which direction is down, the ability to know, without looking, whether you're right side up or upside down. The vestibular system is extraordinarily sensitive. It can be disrupted by all kinds of things: illness, extreme fatigue, alcohol, rapid pressure changes, and according to a body of research that has been growing since the 1980s, certain kinds of low-level electromagnetic exposure. The research on this is not settled science. There are methodological disputes. There are questions about exposure levels and biological mechanisms. This is not a field with clear consensus. But there is enough research to establish that the vestibular system is not immune to electromagnetic influence, and that under certain conditions of exposure, even brief ones, a person's sense of orientation can be subtly but measurably disrupted. Not overwhelmed, not paralyzed, just confused. For a few seconds. In most circumstances that confusion is irrelevant. You notice a brief moment of dizziness, you grab a railing, you steady yourself, it passes. But if you're in deep water when that confusion hits, if you're 30 feet below the surface in Lake Lanier in October and your sense of which way is up suddenly becomes uncertain, those few seconds are not irrelevant at all. They are everything. Reeves wrote in a section of his preliminary paper that he shared with 3 colleagues before his research was halted. The mechanism does not require extraordinary energy to produce a fatal outcome. It requires only that the right disruption occur in the right context. A person who loses vestibular certainty for 8 seconds on dry land will sit down and wait for it to pass. A person who loses vestibular certainty for 8 seconds at depth may die. The lake does not have to do anything dramatic. It only has to be confusing at the wrong moment. The accident pattern, when Reeves completed his overlay analysis, was not a perfect match for the anomaly zones he had identified. He was careful to say that. There were drownings all over the lake, in places with no unusual electromagnetic signature at all. And there were almost certainly anomaly zones that had never been implicated in any accident. But the correlation was there, statistically meaningful, localized, specific to the areas that corresponded to the buried infrastructure. Not random, not coincidence, a pattern. Reeves returned to the lake 3 months after the first survey. The conditions were different this time. There had been a significant rainstorm the previous week. The kind of rainfall event that dramatically increases water conductivity throughout a reservoir system. The water temperature was colder. The lake level was slightly elevated. He went out at night, because his research suggested the effects might be stronger after dark, when regional power consumption patterns shifted and the electromagnetic environment around the transmission infrastructure changed. He was not prepared for what happened. Within 20 minutes of anchoring in the primary anomaly zone, his boat's GPS system froze entirely. Not a slow failure, not a gradual degradation, a complete freeze, displaying his last recorded position as a static image on the screen. The compass on his boat did not drift this time. It spun, a full rotation clockwise before settling approximately 30 degrees off north. The depth finder, the same instrument that had given him strange readings on the first survey, flashed between its normal reading, an impossible 312 feet, and 0, cycling through those 3 numbers in a rhythm that Reeves later described as almost metronomic. And then the radio came to life. He had the radio tuned to the standard maritime hailing frequency. It had been quiet all evening. But at approximately 11:47 in the evening, it produced a sound that Reeves would spend the next several weeks trying to explain. Not static, not the normal hiss and pop of radio interference. A voice, fragmented, distorted beyond easy comprehension, fading in and out of the noise floor, but unmistakably a human voice, with the cadence and formality of a structured communication, a report being made, a location being indicated. Most of the transmission was unintelligible, but one sentence came through with enough clarity that Reeves was able to transcribe it later from his audio recording. Survey team requesting extraction from Sector 5. He checked the recording on his laptop. He checked the file metadata, and the metadata listed the file creation date in a way that the application was clearly unable to reconcile with its own internal clock, because the year it displayed was 1956. This is the part of the story where it's important to be honest about what we know and what we do not. The audio recording exists. Reeves made copies of it. The voice on the recording is real. It is not fabricated audio, and it has been reviewed by people qualified to assess it. What it is, in terms of its origin, is not definitively established. It may be an old transmission, a ghost signal bouncing through atmospheric layers in a way that can occasionally cause very old broadcast recordings to resurface on modern frequencies. This is a known phenomenon, rare but documented. It may be a glitch in the recording software, creating a spurious metadata timestamp. It may be something that does not yet have an adequate technical explanation. What it is not, based on everything Reeves could determine, is a hoax. The sentence itself, survey team requesting extraction from Sector 5, is consistent with the kind of formal communication language used by Cold War-era engineering teams conducting classified field operations. The term Sector 5 corresponds, when mapped against the old core survey documentation, to one of the flagged anomaly zones. Whether that is meaningful coincidence or something else is a question that Reeves was still working on when his research ended. It ended abruptly. 3 weeks after the night survey, Reeves received notification from his university that his research funding was under review, pending an audit related to compliance with federal research protocols. The review was initiated by an agency whose name Reeves was not permitted to disclose under the terms of the review agreement. His research boat was impounded shortly afterward due to alleged permit violations related to nighttime navigation in restricted portions of the reservoir. His external hard drives containing the raw data from both surveys were seized as part of what was described as a safety inquiry into the boat's equipment. He was told the seizure was routine. He was told the equipment would be returned after review. At the time he shared the preliminary paper with his colleagues, the equipment had not been returned. The preliminary paper itself noted, almost as a closing footnote, that within 4 weeks of his seizure, new warning buoys appeared in several locations on Lake Lanier. The buoy placement corresponded closely but not identically to the anomaly zones he had mapped. No explanation was given for the placement of the buoys. No new hazard had been publicly identified. No policy change had been announced. The buoys simply appeared. And the lake continued to attract visitors, millions of them, every year. There is something worth sitting with in the specific shape of this story as we approach the end of tonight's episode. The conspiracy theory that surrounds Lake Lanier most commonly takes the form of supernatural folklore. The drowned towns, the restless dead, the hands that pull swimmers under. These are stories that are emotionally satisfying in a particular way. They give the danger a face, a motivation, a mythological weight. But the conspiracy that Reeves was investigating is something different. It is not about the dead reaching up from the past. It is about the living in the 1950s, making decisions that were never fully accounted for, burying something in the earth, flooding it, walking away from it, and then, over the subsequent 70 years, watching a pattern of accidents accumulate in the vicinity of what they left behind without ever acknowledging the connection. The cover-up in this story is not dramatic. It does not involve black helicopters or secret meetings. It involves the simple and deeply human tendency to avoid acknowledging liability when the cost of acknowledgement is too high. Admitting that the lake had been used as an experimental site would mean admitting that the public was never informed. Admitting that the submerged infrastructure was producing measurable electromagnetic effects would mean admitting that the accident zones were not purely random. Admitting that some of the deaths might have been preventable would mean confronting the possibility that they were foreseeable. None of that is easy, none of that is cheap, and so, instead, the explanation remains what it has always been: alcohol, speed, debris, and bad luck. All true in many cases. But the lake, if Reeves's theory is correct, is not telling the whole story. There is a detail that Reeves included in his preliminary paper that has stayed with me since I first encountered the account. He described the way low-frequency electromagnetic fields interact with the human body in water differently than in air. Water is a conductor. The human body, largely composed of water, becomes part of the electromagnetic circuit in a way that it does not on dry land. The effects of a given field strength are amplified when you are immersed in a conductive medium. What might be a nearly imperceptible disturbance on the surface of a boat becomes something measurably more significant for a swimmer in the water beneath. And the specific kind of disturbance that the Lake Lanier anomaly appeared to produce, the localized brief low-frequency pulse, was in a frequency range that overlapped with what some researchers have called the confusion band, the range at which the vestibular system, the inner ear, and certain autonomic nervous system functions appear to be most susceptible to disruption. Not injury, not incapacitation, confusion, for a few seconds, maybe 11, maybe 8, maybe 5, just long enough for a swimmer to lose their sense of direction in 30 feet of dark water, just long enough for a boater to turn the wheel the wrong way in a moment of sudden, inexplicable spatial disorientation, just long enough for an experienced diver to make the wrong decision about which direction is up. The lake does not need to curse you. It does not need to hate you, or remember you, or want anything from you at all. It only needs to confuse you. For just a moment, in the right place, at the right time, and in certain pockets of Lake Lanier, the evidence suggests those moments happen more often than they should. Before his data was seized, Reeves completed one final analysis. He took every accident report he'd collected that contained at least one anomalous detail: electronic failure, compass disruption, sudden disorientation, unusual equipment behaviour, and he mapped them against his anomaly zones. Then he compared the distribution against the baseline accident rate for the lake as a whole. The difference was statistically significant. The accidents with anomalous details were concentrated in a way that did not match general traffic patterns on the lake. They clustered in the same zones. They recurred seasonally, with peaks in late fall and early spring, which corresponded to the periods of highest water conductivity and the most variable regional power draw. And they had been doing so since at least the 1960s, when the first records he was able to access had been generated. For 60 years, people had been having strange experiences and dying in specific areas of a lake, and the pattern had been sitting in the data the entire time, waiting for someone to put the pieces together. Reeves put the pieces together, and then the pieces were taken away. Tonight, Lake Lanier is open. It is always open, except during severe weather events and the occasional emergency closure. The warning buoys that appeared after Reeves's research was halted are still there. Most visitors do not know what they mean or why they are positioned where they are. The official explanation for their placement, if one was ever given, is not in any public record that I have been able to locate. The lake remains one of Georgia's most beloved recreational destinations. The accident rate has not changed significantly. The cluster zones, as best as independent researchers have been able to determine from publicly available data, remain active. Somewhere beneath the surface, beneath the silt, beneath 60 years of accumulated sediment, the pylons that Reeves's drone found are still there, corroding, generating their small, unpredictable electrochemical fields, activating and subsiding with the seasons and the rain, and the electrical tides of a modern power grid that has grown vastly larger and more complex than anything that existed when the first survey team descended into the valley before the water came. The lake did not become haunted. The haunting is the wrong frame. The lake became something stranger than haunted. The lake became charged, and somewhere in the geography of that charge, in the specific zones where old infrastructure meets mineral-rich earth, meets decades of decay, meets the weight of millions of gallons of conductive water, there is something that does not require you to believe in ghosts. It only requires you to believe in physics, and in the possibility that what is buried beneath a lake does not always stay buried. But sometimes, under the right conditions, it reaches up through the water, not as a hand, not as a spirit, as a signal, And signals, as any geophysicist will tell you, do not care whether or not you believe in them. They only care whether you are in range. Lake Lanier does not need to be cursed. It only needs to confuse you for 11 seconds. Let us go back, though, before we close tonight. Let us go back further than we have gone, because the story of what Lake Lanier is does not begin with the dam, and it does not begin with the 1950s. It begins much further back in the geology of the land itself, in the specific and unusual character of the earth that the Chattahoochee River carved through over millions of years on its way south to the Gulf. Northern Georgia is part of the Blue Ridge physiographic province. If you have ever driven north out of Atlanta toward the mountains, you have seen the land begin to fold. The gentle suburban sprawl gives way to ridgelines. The highways start to curve and climb. The rock faces along highway cuts go from pale sandy sediment to something darker and denser and older. You're entering some of the most geologically ancient terrain in the eastern United States. Rock that has been folded and refolded by continental collisions that happened so long ago that the mountain ranges they built have had time to erode almost entirely away. What was left behind in the deep substrate of northern Georgia is a landscape rich in ferromagnesian minerals, magnetite, ilmenite, pyrrhotite. These are iron-bearing minerals that occur naturally in the kind of ancient metamorphic rock that underlies the Chattahoochee Valley, and they give the soil of that region its distinctive reddish cast. Georgia red clay is not just a regional cliché. It is a direct product of the slow breakdown of iron-rich rock over geological time, and iron-rich soil is magnetic soil, not dramatically so. You would not walk across a Georgia field and feel your pocket compass tug toward the ground. The effect is far too subtle for that. But it is measurable. Geologists have mapped the magnetic anomalies of the southeastern United States in considerable detail, and the patterns of elevated magnetic intensity track closely with the surface expressions of those deep metamorphic formations. The Chattahoochee Valley, specifically the stretch that now lies beneath Lake Lanier, sits in a zone of moderately elevated geomagnetic intensity. It was elevated before the dam was built. It would have been elevated before the first European settlers arrived. The Muskogee people who lived in and around that valley for centuries before displacement were walking over magnetically unusual ground every day of their lives, and the plants and animals and the river itself were all evolving and behaving within that magnetic context. When you flood a valley with 60 feet of water, you do not change the magnetic properties of the bedrock beneath it. You change what sits between the bedrock and the sky above. You add an enormous conductive mass of water. You add decades of accumulating sediment, composed of all the eroded material washing down from the surrounding hills, and you add whatever human artifacts were left behind when the valley was cleared and flooded, the roads and foundations and pipes and equipment and cables and all the rest of it. What you create is a complex layered electromagnetic environment, one that was geomagnetically unusual to begin with, one that has been progressively modified by corrosion and mineral deposition for the better part of a century, and one that, if Reeves's theory is correct, also contains a buried artificial network that was generating its own fields long before the lake was ever imagined. The combination of those factors is what makes the Lanier anomaly different from a simple magnetic lake story, if such a thing even exists in a meaningful way. It is not that the lake sits over naturally magnetic rock, though it does. It is not that the submerged metal infrastructure creates corrosion-driven currents, though it may. It is not that a buried Cold War signal system is still activating after 70 years, though the evidence suggests something along those lines. It is all of those things, interacting with one another in ways that no one fully planned for and no one has fully mapped. A cascade of influences, a system that was never designed but emerged anyway, from the collision of geology and history and human carelessness and governmental secrecy, in a lake in northern Georgia where millions of people come to swim and boat and fish every year. Let us talk about the rescue divers. This is a community that does not often receive the kind of attention it deserves. The men and women who dive into Lake Lanier to recover drowning victims and submerged vehicles are doing work that is profoundly difficult, not just emotionally but technically. Lake Lanier is not a pleasant dive. The water clarity varies dramatically with season and weather conditions. The bottom is chaotic, covered in years of sediment and debris, and the occasional hazard that is genuinely dangerous to a diver who's not expecting it. Visibility can be excellent in winter and nearly zero in summer, when algae blooms cloud the water with green murk, the divers who work Lake Lanier regularly develop a particular kind of expertise about the lake's psychology, if we can use that word without making it sound too strange. They develop a feel for where the lake is going to take a person, where the current patterns and the underwater topography and the thermal layers combine to carry a body after a drowning event. They know which zones to search first. They know which areas to approach with extra caution. And almost without exception, when you talk to experienced Lake Lanier rescue divers about their work, at some point in the conversation they say something that sounds, on the surface, like superstition. They say there are places in the lake where their sense of direction becomes unreliable. Not all of them, not all the time, but enough of them, and consistently enough in the same general areas, that within the Lake Lanier rescue diving community, it is considered basic professional knowledge that certain zones require extra attention to your instruments, because you cannot entirely trust your instincts there. One diver, speaking to a regional news outlet several years ago, put it this way. He said that he had been diving for over 2 decades, including in ocean environments and cave systems, and that in all that time he had learned to trust his body's sense of orientation almost completely. He said that Lake Lanier was the only body of water he had encountered where that trust had been violated in a way he could not explain. He described a specific experience in which he had been following a guideline toward a submerged vehicle, and had become briefly but completely uncertain about the orientation of the surface. Not afraid, he said, just confused. The way you feel when you wake up in an unfamiliar room and cannot immediately work out which direction the door is in. He said it passed in about 10 seconds. He checked his gauges, verified his depth, confirmed his orientation relative to the guideline, and continued. He recovered the vehicle. He surfaced. He reported the experience to his team lead, who nodded in a way that suggested it was not the first time he'd heard something like it. The diver said he had since talked to 5 or 6 other Lake Lanier rescue divers who had experienced something similar, always in the same general zone of the lake, always briefly, always resolving before it became dangerous. Always. So far. Reeves collected 11 accounts like this one. Not from recreational divers, not from inexperienced swimmers, from people who dove for a living or close to it, in a lake they had been working in for years or decades. People who had developed the kind of physiological and psychological calibration that comes only from extensive experience in challenging underwater environments. 11 people who, when asked in careful and neutral language whether they had ever experienced anything unusual in specific zones of Lake Lanier, said yes. The accounts varied in their specifics. Some described the vestibular confusion that the diver above mentioned. Some described a feeling of unusual pressure in the ears that was not consistent with their depth, a sensation as though they were deeper than their gauges indicated. Some described a brief visual disturbance, a kind of shimmering at the edge of their visual field that lasted a few seconds and then stopped, and several described something more subtle, a feeling they struggled to articulate, a sense that the water around them had changed quality in some way, that it felt different, that there was a presence in it that was not there a moment before and then was gone. None of them called it supernatural, most of them were too practical for that language. But all of them acknowledged it as real, as something they had experienced in their bodies, not imagined in their minds. Reeves believed he understood the mechanism behind most of these experiences, if not all of them. The vestibular effects were consistent with low-frequency electromagnetic exposure. The unusual ear pressure was consistent with changes in water conductivity, creating a small but measurable electrostatic gradient around the diver's body. The visual disturbances were potentially consistent with the known effects of certain electromagnetic frequencies on the visual cortex. The feeling that the water had changed quality was harder to account for scientifically. But Reeves noted, in the margin of one of his working documents, that the skin contains electromagnetic receptors that are not consciously processed, that sharks use in their lateral line systems, but that humans retain in a vestigial and largely unacknowledged form. He wrote, "It is possible that what people are experiencing as a change in the quality of the water is a direct somatic response to an electromagnetic event that their conscious minds cannot identify or categorize. The body knows something is different. The mind cannot explain what. Let us talk about the lake from above for a moment. From the air. Lake Lanier, seen from altitude, is a strange shape. Not the familiar oval or teardrop of a natural glacial lake. Not the simple linear form of a river-fed reservoir. Lake Lanier looks from above like something shattered, like a piece of glass dropped on a table and then photographed from overhead. Its shoreline is jagged, deeply indented, cutting into the surrounding hills in dozens of coves and fingers and inlets that extend sometimes a mile or more inland before the water becomes too shallow to navigate. This is because the reservoir did not flood a single river valley. It flooded an entire watershed, the network of tributaries that fed the Chattahoochee from the hills of Hall and Forsyth and Gwinnett counties. When the water rose, it filled not just the main channel of the river, but every creek and stream and drainage that emptied into it. Every farm pond that had been built along those creeks was swallowed. Every low-lying field, every river bottom, every shaded hollow where the old forest had grown along a seasonal creek, all of it went under. The result is a lake with over 700 miles of shoreline, despite covering only 38,000 acres of surface area. That is more shoreline per square acre than almost any reservoir in the country. It creates an extraordinary range of habitat: shallow weedy coves for bass fishing, deep open water for sailing, quiet back channels where the summer heat is muted by the shade of overhanging trees, exposed points where afternoon winds build 3-foot waves that make inexperienced boaters genuinely nervous. It also creates a lake that is extraordinarily difficult to know in its entirety. Even long-time residents who have boated on Lanier for decades will tell you that there are coves they have never fully explored, channels they have never navigated. The lake is too large and too complex for any individual to hold it completely in mind. This is relevant to the Reeves investigation for a practical reason. The anomaly zones that he identified represent only a fraction of the lake's surface area, and he was able to conduct only a limited survey before his research was halted. There may be additional zones he never found. There may be areas where the buried infrastructure creates effects that are different in character from what he documented, stronger perhaps, or affecting different systems, or only active under conditions that did not occur during his survey window. The lake keeps its secrets not because it is mysterious in a supernatural sense, but because it is vast. Because the information needed to understand it fully is either buried under 60 feet of water and decades of sediment, or stored in classified government archives, or simply lost to the ordinary entropy of time and institutional forgetting. There is a particular stretch of Lake Lanier, in the vicinity of what was once known as the Old Browns Bridge Crossing, that local fishermen have discussed for years in the kind of careful, self-deprecating language that people use when they want to describe something strange without sounding like they believe in ghosts. They call it the still zone. Not because the water there is unusually calm, it is not, particularly, but because the electronics seem to go quiet there. Cell service becomes spotty. Radio reception deteriorates. Fish finders give readings that do not match the known bottom topography. None of this is dramatic. None of it has ever made a news story on its own. It is the kind of thing that experienced local anglers accept as a quirk of the lake, the way you might accept that a particular stretch of highway has dead cell coverage. You just know to check your settings before you go in, but when Reeves mapped the still zone against his anomaly data, it corresponded closely with one of the strongest magnetic spike readings his instruments had recorded, and when he researched the historical records for that part of the reservoir, he found that it corresponded to an area where an old iron bridge had been dismantled but not fully removed before the lake filled, and where underground utility lines had once crossed the creek that became the lake's main channel in that section. Buried iron, buried cable, mineral-rich substrate. 7 decades of electrochemical reactions in a conductive medium. The still zone is not mysterious. It is mechanical. But the consequences of that mechanism, for a person in the water at the wrong moment, are the same whether the cause is mysterious or not. Let us talk about what happens to a person in the water, not the drowning. We do not need to dwell on that. Let us talk about what happens in the moments before the crisis, because that is where the Reeves theory has its most disturbing implications. A person enters the water. They are a competent swimmer, or at least someone who is comfortable in water. Maybe they jumped from a dock. Maybe they fell from a boat. Maybe they dove in deliberately for a swim in cove water that looks clear and calm and inviting. For the first several seconds, everything is normal. They orient themselves. They know where they are. They can see the surface above them, the light filtering down through the water in the particular way it does on a summer afternoon, and they know exactly which way is up. Then they move into an anomaly zone, not knowing they have moved into one because there is no sign above the water, no marker, no change in the water's appearance. The vestibular disruption, if it occurs, does not feel like anything dramatic. It does not feel like being struck or grabbed or pulled. It feels like something inside your head shifting. A subtle loss of certainty about your position in space. The kind of feeling you might get standing on a boat deck in a light swell. That moment when the horizon and your inner ear disagree slightly about which way is level. On land, your eyes correct for this immediately. You look at a fixed reference point, the horizon, a wall, the floor, and your brain reconciles the visual information with the vestibular signal and settles on an answer. The disorientation passes. In murky water, you may not have a visual reference point, or the visual reference points you do have, the diffuse glow of the surface above you, the darker shadow of the bottom below, may become less reliable when your inner ear is telling you something different from what your eyes expect. This is the cascade that Reeves described as the confusion window, the few seconds in which a person's brain is receiving contradictory information from its orientation systems and has not yet resolved the contradiction. In most circumstances, the window closes quickly. The brain finds its reference, reconciles the inputs, and restores certainty. But in those few seconds, decisions get made. Reflexes fire. A person may stroke in what feels like the right direction but is not. They may kick toward what feels like the surface and swim deeper instead. They may exhale a breath of air that they needed because they felt the disorientation as the sensation of surfacing, when in fact they had not surfaced at all. And if they inhale water in that moment, the cascade takes on a different character entirely, one that does not resolve. Reeves did not claim that this mechanism explained every Lake Lanier drowning. He was careful about that. He said the data was consistent with a contribution from this mechanism in a subset of accidents, particularly those involving experienced swimmers in clear conditions with no obvious cause. A subset, but even a small subset in a lake where so many people have died, represents real human lives, real families, real questions that have gone unanswered for decades. Those families, in many cases, have been told that their loved ones died because of a bad decision, or bad luck, or something that could not have been predicted. Some of that is true, but some of it, if Reeves is right, is incomplete. There is a document that Reeves found near the end of his research, before his data was seized, that is in some ways the most disturbing piece of evidence in this entire story. It is not classified, it is not redacted, it is a public document, available to anyone who knows where to look and how to interpret what they are reading. It is an internal Corps of Engineers evaluation from 1961, 5 years after the reservoir was completed and open to recreation, that evaluated the safety of the lake for public use. The evaluation was generally positive. The dam was functioning correctly, the lake was filling as expected, the recreational infrastructure was coming together, but buried in appendix materials attached to the evaluation was a note from a staff hydrologist. A brief note, 3 paragraphs, noting that several of the baseline electromagnetic readings taken in certain zones of the reservoir had come back elevated compared to what pre-filling surveys had predicted. The hydrologist's note said this was likely due to corrosion effects on buried metallic infrastructure and recommended that the zones be monitored. There is no evidence of subsequent monitoring, or if monitoring occurred, it was not documented in any public record. 3 paragraphs, 1961. If someone had followed that thread in 1961, what would they have found? What might have been done differently? What warnings might have been issued? What zones might have been marked? We cannot answer those questions now. The 60 years since that note was written have filled the lake with sediment and filled the accident records with names, and the only thing we know for certain is that the recommendation to monitor was not pursued in any publicly documented way. The hydrologist who wrote that note died in 1987. His personal records, if he kept any, have not been located. The note itself exists only in a microfiche copy of the original evaluation, held in a regional archive in Georgia. It has never been cited in any subsequent official documentation about Lake Lanier that is accessible to the public. It sat in that archive for 60 years. Reeves found it 2 weeks before his data drives were seized. He made a photocopy. The photocopy survived. We are near the end of the lake now, near the end of the water, and near the end of tonight's episode, and it feels right to pause for a moment at the surface before we come up. There is something about Lake Lanier that the data and the theories and the careful academic language of Reeves's investigation cannot quite capture, and that is the emotional reality of the place. the way it holds two entirely different experiences simultaneously. On a warm Saturday in July, with the boat wake spreading across the main channel and the laughter from the dock bars carrying across the water, and the afternoon sun turning the whole lake into something that looks like hammered copper, Lake Lanier is one of the genuinely beautiful places in the American South. People love it. They have been coming back to it for generations. Families have vacation homes on its shores. Children learn to water ski in its coves. Old couples watch the sunset from the same dock they have been watching it from for 40 years. That is also Lake Lanier. The beauty is real. The community around it is real. The pleasure that millions of people take in it every year is real and legitimate, and not diminished by anything in tonight's story. But beneath the surface, the other lake exists. The one that was flooded and forgotten. The one that carries the geological memory of an ancient iron-rich landscape, and the industrial memory of everything that was buried when the water rose. The one with the pylons in the silt, and the ghost of a survey that recommended further study in 1961, and the buoys that appeared without explanation in the zones a geophysicist had mapped the year before. Both of those lakes are real. Both of them are Lake Lanier. The tragedy of the place, if there is one that transcends the individual tragedies of the people who have died there, is that the two lakes exist in almost complete ignorance of each other. The millions of people on the surface do not know about the one beneath, and the one beneath does not know anything at all, because it is not sentient, not conscious, not aware. It is just geology and history and electrochemistry, doing what geology and history and electrochemistry do, which is to proceed according to their own logic regardless of whether anyone is watching. 11 seconds is not a long time. It is not enough time to swim even a single body length in a moment of panic. It is not enough time to think clearly if your orientation systems are in conflict. It is not enough time to call for help or signal a boat, or take a breath you did not intend to take. But it is more than enough time for a lake to do what Lake Lanier, in certain pockets, under certain conditions, appears to do. And when it does, it leaves no evidence, no mark, no indication that anything unusual occurred. The water closes over whatever happens beneath it, and the surface goes smooth again, and the boats move on, and the sun keeps moving across the sky, and the lake keeps its reputation as a dangerous place, for all the ordinary reasons that anyone can see. And somewhere in the silt, at a depth of 38 feet, the pylons wait, corroding, activating, being still. Lake Lanier does not need to be cursed. It only needs to confuse you for 11 seconds. They heard something during radio silence that made them question whether to report it at all. 3 astronauts circling the moon in December of 1968, experiencing something so strange during their passes over the far side that years later they would still struggle to describe it. Professional test pilots, men trained to observe and report with precision, reduced to vague emotional descriptions of landscapes that felt wrong and sounds that seemed impossible. That was just the beginning. Before we go further, I want to thank Mike Hunt for suggesting tonight's story. And if you're enjoying this content and listening on Spotify, leaving a review helps us tremendously. If you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. And if you enjoy this kind of deep investigation into mysteries at the edge of human knowledge, please consider subscribing. It means everything to us. And a special thank you to Mike Hunt for suggesting tonight's story. This one's for you. There's something unsettling about a face you can never see. The moon hangs in our sky every night, a constant companion to humanity's existence. Yet we only ever see one side of it. The same craters, the same Maria, the same ancient scars illuminated by reflected sunlight. For thousands of years we assumed that was all there was. We were wrong. The far side of the moon remained hidden from human eyes until the space age, and when we finally glimpsed it, what we found didn't match what we expected. The terrain was different, darker, stranger. And in the decades since, despite all our technological advances, despite satellites and orbiters and landing missions, there are still things about the far side that don't add up. Tonight, we're going to explore what might be hiding on the side of the moon that never faces Earth, why certain missions experience phenomena they couldn't explain, and why the world's superpowers are now racing to establish permanent infrastructure in the one place in our solar system that's completely shielded from observation. This is the story of the dark side of the moon, and the signal that might be waiting there. Chapter 1. The Side We Never See. To understand why the far side of the moon matters, you first need to understand why it exists at all. The moon is tidally locked with Earth. This isn't magic or coincidence, it's physics. Over billions of years, gravitational forces synchronize the moon's rotation with its orbit. One full rotation takes exactly as long as one orbit around Earth. The result is that the same hemisphere perpetually faces our planet. For all of human history, we could only see roughly 59% of the moon's surface. The rest remained invisible, impossible to observe from Earth. Ancient astronomers could map the visible side in extraordinary detail, but the far side was pure speculation. Philosophers wondered what lay beyond that curve of rock. Some imagined mirror landscapes, identical to what we could see. Others proposed exotic features, unique geological formations that existed nowhere on the visible hemisphere. A few even suggested the far side might harbour life, protected from Earth's observation by the moon's bulk. All of these theories remained untestable until the 20th century brought rocket technology and the space race between global superpowers. That changed in the late 1950s. The Soviet space program launched Luna 3 in October of that year. It was a relatively simple probe by today's standards, weighing less than 300 kilograms and carrying a primitive camera system that used actual photographic film. But its mission was historic: photograph the far side of the moon for the first time in human history. The mission profile was complex. Luna 3 had to reach the moon, position itself correctly, photograph the hidden hemisphere, develop the film on board using an automated chemical processing system, and then transmit the images back to Earth using a scanning system that converted the photographs into radio signals. Every step had to work perfectly. There were no second chances. If the camera failed, if the film didn't develop, if the transmission system malfunctioned, the mission would return nothing. The probe succeeded. It captured 17 images before its film supply ran out, then transmitted them back to Earth via a primitive scanning system that took hours to send a single photograph. When scientists at the Soviet Academy of Sciences developed those images, they found something unexpected. The far side looked nothing like the near side. Where the near side featured broad, dark plains called Maria, ancient lava flows that formed the familiar face of the moon, the far side was almost entirely covered in craters, heavily cratered, densely packed impact scars stretching across nearly the entire visible surface. The contrast was stark and immediately puzzling. Why would one hemisphere be so different from the other? The Maria on the near side were formed when asteroid impacts punched through the lunar crust, allowing molten rock from the interior to flow out and fill the impact basins. This created the smooth, dark plains we recognise from Earth. But the far side showed almost none of this volcanism. The crust there appeared thicker, preventing the same geological process from occurring. Scientists proposed explanations involving crustal thickness variations and the moon's internal structure, suggesting that the far side's thicker crust had prevented volcanic flooding, even when major impacts occurred. The theory was sound, supported by what little data existed about lunar composition, but the images from Luna 3 were grainy, incomplete, and limited in scope. Large portions of the far side remained unmapped. The camera system could only capture about 70% of the hidden hemisphere, leaving significant gaps in coverage. And curiously, the Soviet Union was selective about which images they released to the public. The initial announcement came with great fanfare. The Soviet press celebrated the achievement extensively, Premier Nikita Khrushchev presented Luna 3 images to international scientific conferences as proof of Soviet technological superiority. But some researchers would later note that certain frames from the Luna 3 mission were never published in scientific journals. The official explanation was that they were too degraded to be useful, damaged during the onboard film development process, or corrupted during radio transmission. This explanation was plausible. The technology was primitive, and failures were common. Many early space missions lost significant amounts of data to technical problems. But conspiracy theorists would eventually argue something else, that those missing frames showed something the Soviets didn't want the world to see. Something unusual, something that didn't fit the expected pattern of impact craters in ancient geology. No evidence ever emerged to support this theory. The missing frames remained missing, if they ever existed at all. But the idea planted itself in the minds of people who were paying close attention to lunar exploration. The seed of doubt had been planted. What else might be hidden on the far side? What might those grainy, incomplete images have missed? For now, though, the far side remained mostly a mystery, a heavily cratered alien landscape that no human eye had ever directly witnessed, a place that existed only in low-resolution photographs and scientific speculation. The Soviet achievement had opened a door, but it hadn't revealed what lay beyond. That would require more missions, better technology, and eventually human eyes in lunar orbit. The race to see more had only just begun, and as it intensified, as both superpowers poured resources into lunar exploration, the questions about the far side would only multiply, because the more we looked, the stranger it became. Chapter 2. Mapping the Unknown. By the early 1960s, the United States had entered the space race in full force. The Soviet success with Luna 3 had been a propaganda victory, and American scientists were determined to not just match but exceed Soviet achievements. President John Kennedy had committed the nation to landing humans on the moon before the decade ended. That goal dominated public attention and drove NASA's mission planning. But behind the scenes, there was another priority that received less publicity, but equal scientific importance: comprehensive mapping of the moon's surface, especially the mysterious far side. NASA rapidly developed its lunar exploration program. The Ranger series of spacecraft would crash into the moon while transmitting photographs during their descent. The Surveyor series would soft land and analyze surface, composition, and the Lunar Orbiter series would map the entire surface from orbit, providing the detailed photographs needed to select landing sites for future crewed missions. The initial focus was on understanding the moon's surface composition, topography, and potential hazards for landing spacecraft. Scientists needed to know if the surface was solid or covered in deep dust. They needed to identify flat areas suitable for landing. They needed to map the distribution of boulders and craters that might damage a spacecraft. But there was another priority, one less discussed in public announcements: comprehensive mapping of the far side. The United States launched a series of probes designed to photograph and analyze lunar geography. These missions captured thousands of images, slowly building a more complete picture of the moon's hidden hemisphere. What they found continued to puzzle planetary scientists. The far side wasn't just more heavily cratered, it was fundamentally different in composition. The crust was thicker, as the Soviet findings had suggested. The surface was darker, with different reflective properties than the near side. There were fewer of the smooth basaltic plains that characterized the near side. And perhaps most intriguingly, there were features that didn't quite fit the expected patterns of impact geology. Small anomalies, unusual formations, shadows that suggested geometric precision. Most of these were easily explained as pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns where none exist, or as natural geological processes that simply appeared artificial due to lighting conditions and camera angles. Impact craters could create remarkably regular shapes. Volcanic features could produce straight lines. Erosion from micrometeorite bombardment over billions of years could smooth certain formations while leaving others rough, but not all of them. One particular formation, photographed by Lunar Orbiter 3 in early 1967, generated significant internal discussion at NASA. It appeared to be a perfectly straight line, several kilometres long, cutting across the floor of a far-side crater. The line was narrow, perhaps only a few metres wide, but its linearity was extraordinary. Planetary geologists examined the image extensively. They proposed several natural explanations. It could be a fault line, where the lunar crust had fractured and shifted. It could be a lava flow boundary, where different eruptions had created distinct edges. It could even be a camera artifact, a flaw in the imaging system that created an apparent line where none existed. Each explanation had problems. Fault lines on the Moon typically showed irregularities and variations. This line was straight to within the resolution limits of the camera. Lava flow boundaries could be linear, but rarely over such distances. And if it was a camera artifact, why didn't similar artifacts appear in other images from the same spacecraft? The formation was catalogued, noted in technical reports, and filed away for future study. NASA's official position was consistent. The far side was scientifically interesting, but not fundamentally mysterious. Everything observed could be explained through conventional planetary science. But there was something the public didn't fully grasp at the time. All of these early observations were done remotely, from orbit, with limited photographic technology. Resolution was poor by modern standards, coverage was incomplete, and most importantly, there was a significant time delay between image capture and public release. NASA controlled the flow of information completely. Researchers within the agency had access to raw data that the public would never see. Classification protocols, initially developed for national security purposes during the Cold War, meant that certain findings could be withheld indefinitely if they were deemed sensitive. The question, of course, is what would qualify as sensitive about lunar geography. The official answer was simple: anything that might give the Soviet Union strategic information about potential landing sites or resource locations. During the height of the Cold War, this justification was accepted without much scrutiny. The military was deeply involved in the space program. Classification was standard procedure. But years later, some former NASA personnel would suggest that classifications went beyond simple Cold War paranoia. They would suggest that some images were classified because of what they showed, not because of where they showed it. These suggestions were always vague, offered in retirement when the consequences of speaking out were minimal. No one provided concrete examples. No classified images were leaked. The claims remained tantalizingly unspecific. But the pattern was clear. Something about far-side observations made NASA nervous in ways that near-side observations didn't. By the mid-1960s, the American space program had shifted focus from simple observation to something far more ambitious, putting humans on the Moon. Orbital mapping became a secondary priority. Public attention moved to the astronauts, the rockets, the dramatic countdowns and fiery launches. The Apollo program dominated headlines. Every test flight, every technical milestone, every training exercise became news. The world watched as NASA built the infrastructure to achieve Kennedy's goal of landing humans on the Moon before the decade ended. But behind the scenes, the mapping continued, and the anomalies accumulated. Lunar orbiter spacecraft circled the Moon, photographing every crater and mountain, building a comprehensive atlas of the surface. They focused on potential landing sites on the near side, but they also systematically imaged the far side. Some of those far side images never made it into the public archives. They were classified immediately upon receipt, reviewed by personnel with appropriate security, clearances, and stored in secure facilities. The stated reason was protection of potential future landing sites or areas of strategic interest. But NASA had already announced that all Apollo landings would occur on the near side, where communications with Earth would be possible. There was no operational reason to land on the far side during the Apollo program. The technical challenges were too great. So why classify far side images if they had no relevance to the Apollo mission? The answer, according to official records, was that the classifications were precautionary. Future missions might explore the far side. Better to protect the information now than worry about it later. Critics would argue this explanation made little sense. Maps of the far side would eventually become public as better missions flew. Classifying them temporarily achieved nothing except creating gaps in the public understanding of lunar geography. unless, of course, those specific images showed something that NASA wanted time to understand before facing public questions. By the late 1960s, NASA had accumulated more data about the moon than any organisation in history. They had thousands of photographs, millions of data points, comprehensive maps of elevation and composition, and somewhere in that vast archive, according to the conspiracy theories that would later emerge, were images that showed the far side wasn't quite as empty as it appeared. But for now, all of that remained hidden behind security classifications and bureaucratic control of information. The public saw what NASA chose to release. Everything else remained locked away. The first humans would soon orbit the moon, and when they did, they would see the far side with their own eyes, not through camera lenses or photographic film. What they reported from those observations would become the subject of debate and speculation for decades to come. Chapter 3: Apollo 8 and the Silence. December of 1968. Apollo 8 launched from Kennedy Space Center carrying 3 astronauts, Frank Borman, James Lovell and William Anders. Their mission was unprecedented and extraordinarily risky. They would be the first humans to leave Earth orbit, travel to the moon and enter lunar orbit. The Apollo program was behind schedule. The lunar module wasn't ready for testing, but NASA was concerned that the Soviet Union might attempt a crude lunar flyby before the United States could land on the moon. The decision was made to accelerate the schedule and send Apollo 8 to lunar orbit even without the landing spacecraft. It was an enormous risk. The spacecraft had never been tested in deep space. The navigation systems, while sophisticated for their time, were primitive by modern standards. The crew would travel farther from Earth than any humans in history. If something went wrong, rescue would be impossible. There were dozens of potential failure points, any one of which could strand the crew in space or send them hurtling past the moon into an orbit around the sun from which they could never return. The engine that would slow them into lunar orbit had to fire perfectly, or they would miss the moon entirely. The engine that would bring them home had to work on the first attempt, or they would be trapped in lunar orbit until life support failed. But the mission succeeded. Apollo 8 reached the moon on Christmas Eve and fired its main engine to slow into orbit. For the next 20 hours, the crew circled the moon 10 times, taking photographs, conducting observations, and becoming the first humans to see the far side with their own eyes. Each orbit took approximately 2 hours, and during each orbit the spacecraft passed behind the moon, completely cut off from radio contact with Earth. This wasn't unexpected. Radio waves can't pass through solid matter. When Apollo 8 disappeared behind the lunar horizon, all communications ceased. Mission Control in Houston could only wait, monitoring timers, calculating trajectories, hoping the spacecraft would emerge on schedule. The communications blackout lasted roughly 45 minutes each orbit. During that time, the crew was completely alone, more isolated from humanity than anyone had ever been. They couldn't call for help if something went wrong. They couldn't receive guidance if they encountered problems. They were entirely dependent on their spacecraft, their training, and each other, and they were passing over the far side, seeing landscapes no human eyes had ever witnessed. The crew described the experience in their post-mission reports and subsequent interviews. They spoke of the alien nature of the terrain below. Where the near side was familiar from photographs and telescopic observation, the far side was completely new. Every crater was unnamed. Every mountain range was unknown. They were seeing pristine terrain that had never been viewed by conscious observers. It always did emerge, on schedule. But something about those passages disturbed the crew in ways they struggled to articulate. Years later, during interviews and memoir accounts, the Apollo 8 astronauts would describe the experience of passing over the far side as deeply unsettling. Not because of what they saw exactly, but because of what they felt. The descriptions were vague, almost reluctant. They spoke of an overwhelming sense of isolation, of being farther from humanity than anyone had ever been. They described the landscape below as ancient, hostile, and utterly lifeless. One astronaut mentioned that the far side looked wrong compared to the near side, though he couldn't articulate exactly what he meant. This vagueness is interesting. These were trained test pilots, men selected for their ability to observe and report technical details accurately. They were accustomed to describing complex situations clearly, yet when discussing the far side, their language became imprecise and emotional. Frank Borman, the mission commander, later stated that the far side had a forbidding quality. He described it as looking like it had been worked over by a cosmic sledgehammer for billions of years. This was accurate from a geological perspective. The far side was heavily cratered, but the emotional weight in his description suggested something beyond simple scientific observation. James Lovell described the sensation of radio silence as creating a loneliness that was almost physical. He mentioned that during the far side passes, the crew became quieter, more contemplative. The usual banter and conversation that characterized their communications with Houston stopped when they went behind the moon. William Anders, who took the famous Earthrise photograph showing Earth rising above the lunar horizon, later said that seeing the far side made him understand how truly empty space was. Not just physically empty, but existentially empty. A vast cosmic wasteland where nothing lived and nothing changed. These descriptions could be entirely psychological. The far side passes represented maximum isolation. Every human instinct would react to being completely cut off from Earth, alone on the night side of an alien world. The emotional responses could be perfectly natural reactions to an extreme environment. But the official transcripts of the mission contain something curious. Most of the mission audio is preserved and publicly available. NASA recorded all communications between the crew and mission control, and those recordings have been digitized and released. Researchers can listen to the entire mission from launch to splashdown. But there are gaps in the audio recordings. Not during the far side passes, when radio silence was expected and no communication was possible, but during other portions of the mission. Brief sections where the official NASA transcripts simply note unintelligible or technical interference. These gaps are short, usually only a few seconds, and NASA explained them as routine transmission problems caused by distance and equipment limitations. The Apollo communication system was complex, involving multiple tracking stations around Earth, spacecraft systems operating at the edge of their capabilities, and radio signals travelling hundreds of thousands of kilometres. Technical problems were common. Static, interference, and dropped signals occurred regularly during all Apollo missions. The presence of unintelligible sections in the transcripts was not unusual, yet some researchers claim to have obtained alternative recordings, supposedly leaked by unnamed NASA personnel, that contained audio from these gaps. In these unofficial recordings, which began circulating in conspiracy research communities in the late 1970s, the astronauts allegedly discuss seeing unusual things on the far side. Lights where no lights should be, structures that appeared artificial, movement in areas that should be completely static. NASA categorically denied the authenticity of these recordings. They were dismissed as hoaxes, fabrications created by conspiracy theorists to generate attention or support pre-existing beliefs about alien activity. The agency pointed out that no verified source for these alternative audio files had ever been produced. No one had come forward with original recordings. No whistleblowers had provided documentation. And indeed, analysis of the leaked recordings revealed problems. The audio quality was inconsistent with genuine Apollo communications. The background sounds didn't match the spacecraft environment. Some of the conversations included references to things that wouldn't have been visible from Apollo 8's orbital altitude. The recordings were almost certainly fake, but their existence raised interesting questions. Why would someone go to the effort of fabricating detailed audio that sounded like Apollo transmissions? What motivated the hoax? And why did the fabricated conversations focus specifically on far-side observations? One possibility was simply the enduring human fascination with mysteries. The far side represented unknown territory. Creating fake recordings about discoveries there tapped into that fascination and generated attention. Another possibility, suggested by conspiracy theorists, was that the fake recordings were created as a form of disclosure. If something had actually been observed during Apollo 8, but the genuine audio remained classified, then creating fake versions of similar conversations might be a way to introduce the truth disguised as fiction. This theory required believing in elaborate games of misdirection by unknown parties within NASA or the intelligence community. Most researchers found it implausible. The simpler explanation was that someone created fake recordings because they could, and because people would find them intriguing. But one detail particularly bothered some researchers. In post-mission debriefings, the Apollo 8 crew reportedly spent an unusual amount of time discussing their observations of the far side. These debriefings were classified at the time, which wasn't uncommon. Much of the Apollo program operated under military security protocols due to its connections with ballistic missile technology and Cold War competition. What was uncommon was how long those specific debriefing documents remained classified. Most Apollo mission files were declassified within 15 to 20 years. Technical information about spacecraft systems, navigation procedures, and mission operations became public as the Apollo program ended and NASA shifted focus to other projects. The far-side observation reports from Apollo 8 weren't fully released until decades later, and even then, when they finally entered the public domain, significant portions were redacted. The official explanation was that the redactions protected proprietary technical information about camera, systems, and orbital mechanics. Some passages discussed classified military sensor technology that had been adapted for NASA use. Other sections contained information about observation techniques that remained sensitive for national security reasons. Critics argued that this seemed implausible for what should have been straightforward geological observations. The crew was looking at the moon, taking photographs, describing what they saw. What aspect of that required classification extending decades beyond the mission? NASA's response was bureaucratic. The classification had been applied according to standard protocols. The documents had been reviewed on regular schedules. They were declassified when appropriate authorities determined the information was no longer sensitive. This was technically true, but it didn't explain why observations of lunar craters and mountains would be considered sensitive in the first place. The Apollo 8 mission returned to Earth on December 27th, 1968. The crew splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean, completing one of the most ambitious and risky missions in history. They were celebrated as heroes, lauded for their courage and technical skill. Public attention immediately shifted to the next goal, landing on the moon. Apollo 9 and 10 would test the lunar module and verify landing procedures. Apollo 11 would make the attempt. The strange observations from the far side, if they existed at all, were buried under the momentum of the space program's greatest achievement. But for those paying attention, questions remained. What did the astronauts really see during those silent orbits? Why did their descriptions carry such emotional weight? And why did NASA seem so reluctant to discuss those observations in detail? The answers, if they existed, remained locked in classified files and fading memories. But the questions wouldn't go away. As more missions flew, as more astronauts orbited the moon and passed over the far side, the pattern of strange experiences would continue. And eventually those experiences would include something that couldn't be easily dismissed or explained away. Chapter 4. The Unverified Claims. In the decades following the Apollo program, rumours began to circulate among space exploration enthusiasts and conspiracy researchers. These weren't the usual moon landing hoax claims, which alleged that the entire Apollo program was faked in a television studio. Those theories, while persistent, were easily debunked by examining the evidence. These new rumours were something different, more specific, more troubling. The core allegation was this. During the Apollo missions, particularly those that orbited the moon, astronauts reported hearing strange sounds while passing over the far side. The claims first appeared in the late 1970s, mentioned in fringe publications and UFO research newsletters. They described unusual whistling noises, mechanical tones and rhythmic patterns that couldn't be attributed to spacecraft systems or radio interference. The sounds allegedly occurred only when the spacecraft was over the far side, never during near-side passes. NASA dismissed these claims immediately. Agency spokespeople explained that radio interference, thermal expansion of spacecraft components, and electromagnetic effects in the lunar environment could all produce unusual sounds. The spacecraft itself generated constant noise. Fans, pumps, cooling systems, electrical systems, all creating a background soundscape that astronauts lived with for days or weeks at a time. Human perception, in stressful, isolated environments could also create auditory illusions. Pattern recognition in random noise was well documented. The brain would sometimes interpret meaningless sounds as having structure or significance, especially when exhausted or under psychological pressure. All of these explanations were scientifically valid, and for years that seemed to be the end of the discussion. The strange sounds were dismissed as either misperceptions or hoaxes. But in the early 21st century, something unexpected happened. NASA itself released audio recordings from the Apollo 10 mission that seemed to validate at least part of the conspiracy theory. Apollo 10, which flew in May of 1969, was the final dress rehearsal before Apollo 11's historic landing. The crew orbited the moon 31 times, coming within 15 kilometers of the surface during practice runs for the landing approach. It was a comprehensive test of all systems and procedures. During several passes over the far side, the astronauts reported hearing strange whistling sounds through their headsets. The sounds lasted for nearly an hour. They were loud enough that the crew discussed them at length, trying to identify the source. In the recorded conversations, you can hear genuine puzzlement and concern in their voices. "You hear that? That whistling sound?" "Yeah, I hear it too. What's that?" "It sounds like outer space type music. It's really weird. Should we tell them about this?" "I don't know. Let's keep monitoring it." The conversation continued for some time, with the crew trying to troubleshoot what they were hearing. They checked their equipment, verified that all systems were functioning normally, and ruled out various technical sources. Eventually they decided to mention it to Mission Control, though their report was carefully worded. They described it as unusual radio interference, possibly related to electromagnetic effects from the spacecraft's systems. Mission Control noted the report but didn't seem particularly concerned. The mission continued without incident. NASA's explanation, both at the time and when the audio was publicly released decades later, was that the sounds were caused by radio interference between the command module and the lunar module communication systems. The two vehicles were flying in close formation during that portion of the mission, and their radios were both transmitting. This could create interference patterns that produced unusual sounds, a technical glitch, nothing more. But audio analysts who examined the recordings noted something curious. The sounds had structure. They weren't random static or white noise. There were patterns, repetitions, almost musical qualities to the whistling. Some researchers ran the audio through spectral analysis software, converting the sounds into visual representations showing the frequencies and patterns. They claimed to find embedded frequencies that didn't match any known spacecraft systems. The patterns suggested something more than simple radio interference. Others argued this was simply confirmation bias, seeing patterns in random noise because they wanted to find something significant. Human brains are extraordinarily good at finding structure in chaos. Musical patterns especially are something we readily perceive even when they don't objectively exist. What made the story more compelling, however, were the astronauts' reactions. In the recorded conversations, the crew sounds genuinely puzzled by what they're hearing. These weren't men prone to panic or superstition. They were experienced test pilots, engineers, veterans of high-risk military operations. They had been through exhaustive training that prepared them for virtually every contingency. Yet they spent significant time discussing these sounds, trying to identify the source, ruling out equipment malfunctions, and notably they discussed whether to even mention it to Mission Control, worried about how it might sound. Should we report this? I don't know, it's probably nothing. But it's been going on for a while now. Let's wait and see if it continues. That hesitation is what conspiracy theorists found most interesting. Why would experienced test pilots worry about reporting a technical anomaly unless they suspected it might be interpreted as something more than technical? NASA maintained that the astronauts were simply being cautious, avoiding unnecessary alarm during a critical mission. Apollo 10 was the final test before the moon landing. Every system had to work perfectly. The crew didn't want to create confusion or distraction over something that might be trivial, but skeptics pointed out that these were men who regularly dealt with life-threatening malfunctions. During previous missions, astronauts had calmly reported serious problems, from equipment failures to medical issues. A strange sound shouldn't have prompted that level of concern, unless they suspected it wasn't coming from their spacecraft. The Apollo 10 audio became a focal point for far-side conspiracy theories. If genuine anomalies had been recorded during that mission, what else might have been documented and not released? Former NASA personnel, speaking anonymously in interviews years after retirement occasionally, hinted at other incidents, unexplained sensor readings, visual anomalies that didn't match photographic evidence, data that didn't fit expectations. One retired engineer claimed that during Apollo missions, there were instances where ground-based tracking detected unusual electromagnetic signatures coming from the lunar surface. These signatures didn't match any known geological process or solar radiation effect. They appeared briefly, then disappeared, never lasting long enough for detailed analysis. Another former technician mentioned that some mission photographs, particularly from the far side, showed light anomalies that couldn't be explained by camera flares or reflections. Small bright spots in permanently shadowed craters where no light should penetrate. But none of these sources ever provided concrete evidence. No documents were leaked, no photographs were produced. The claims remained tantalizingly unverifiable. What is documented, however, is that NASA became increasingly restrictive about what information from later Apollo missions was made public. Mission transcripts were edited for length and clarity, which was presented as standard practice to make them more readable. Photographs were curated, with only the most scientifically or aesthetically interesting images released. And certain technical data remained classified long after any reasonable national security justification had expired. The pattern suggested something beyond routine information control. It suggested selective disclosure, as if someone within NASA had decided that not everything observed during the Apollo missions should reach public awareness. The question was why, and the answer, if it existed, seemed to be hidden somewhere in the vast archives of lunar observation data that NASA had accumulated over decades of missions. As the Apollo program ended and NASA shifted focus to space shuttle development and orbital stations, public interest in the moon waned. The far side became a scientific curiosity again, studied by planetary geologists but largely forgotten by the general public. But in the emerging internet communities of the 1990s and early 2000s, interest in lunar mysteries remained strong. Researchers shared information, analysed available data, and built networks of people investigating unexplained aspects of space exploration. These communities preserved the Apollo 10 audio, the claims about strange sounds and observations, the hints from former personnel. They kept asking questions even when official sources had moved on to other topics, and eventually their persistence would be validated in an unexpected way. Because modern lunar observation missions would begin detecting anomalies that aligned with the old conspiracy theories, not perfectly, not conclusively, but enough to suggest that maybe, just maybe, there had been something to those unverified claims after all. Chapter 5. The modern mapping era. By the 1990s, technology had advanced dramatically. The blurry photographs and limited data from the Apollo era were being replaced by high-resolution orbital imagery from sophisticated unmanned spacecraft. The far side of the moon was about to be mapped in unprecedented detail. Computer processing power had increased exponentially. Digital cameras had replaced film. Spacecraft could carry instruments that analysed composition, measured elevation, detected magnetic fields, and mapped the distribution of elements across the lunar surface. The Clementine mission launched in early 1994. It was a joint project between NASA and the Department of Defense, officially designed to test sensors and spacecraft components for the Strategic Defense Initiative, the missile defense system that had been a priority during the Cold War. But its scientific mission was mapping the moon. Clementine spent 2 months in lunar orbit, capturing over 1.5 million images using multiple cameras and sensors. It mapped the entire surface at resolutions far exceeding anything previously achieved. The data revealed new details about lunar composition, topography, and geological history. The mission discovered ice in permanently shadowed craters near the lunar poles, confirming predictions that water might exist in these cold traps. It measured the thickness of the lunar crust in different regions. It created detailed elevation maps showing the moon's complex topography. It also revealed new anomalies. Researchers analysing Clementine data noticed several unusual features on the far side. Most were quickly explained as natural formations resulting from impact processes, volcanic activity, or erosion from billions of years of micrometeorite bombardment. But a few defied easy categorization. There were areas where the terrain appeared unnaturally smooth, lacking the expected density of small impact craters. Planetary scientists proposed that these areas might have experienced relatively recent geological activity, with lava flows or landslides covering older terrain. But the Moon was supposed to be geologically dead, with no significant activity for billions of years. There were shadows that suggested vertical structures, though most of these could be explained as lighting effects on crater walls or boulder formations. The human eye and brain naturally interpret shadows as indicating three-dimensional objects, even when the actual topology is more complex. And there were formations with geometric regularity that seemed statistically unlikely to be purely natural. Linear features, right angles, symmetrical arrangements that appeared too organised to result from random geological processes. NASA published papers about these findings, always with careful scientific caveats. The agency emphasised that unusual didn't mean artificial. Natural processes could create apparently geometric patterns. Volcanic activity could produce straight lines when lava flowed along fault lines. Tectonic stress could create parallel fractures. Impact ejecta could land in organised patterns. Every explanation was scientifically valid. But the accumulation of anomalies began to strain statistical expectations. How many unusual but natural formations could exist before you had to consider that some might actually be unusual because they weren't entirely natural? The images sparked intense debate in online forums and research communities. Amateur analysts began downloading the raw data from NASA's public archives and conducting their own investigations. They created enhancement algorithms to bring out subtle details. They adjusted contrast and brightness to reveal features not visible in the original images. They measured angles and proportions, comparing formations across different regions. Some claimed to find evidence of structures, towers rising from crater floors, bridges spanning chasms, arrangements of objects that appeared deliberately positioned. Even what appeared to be artificial lighting in permanently shadowed craters, sources of illumination that couldn't be explained by reflected sunlight. NASA's response was consistent. People were seeing what they wanted to see. The human brain is wired to recognize patterns, especially artificial ones. This cognitive bias, combined with poor understanding of geological processes and image artifacts, led to false positives. Every alleged structure had a prosaic explanation. Planetary geologists patiently explained how natural processes could create these apparent anomalies. They showed examples from Earth where wind, water, and geological forces had created remarkably geometric formations. They demonstrated how lighting angles could create illusions of structures where none existed. Yet the agency's defensiveness struck some observers as excessive. Why devote so much effort to debunking amateur photoanalysis if there was nothing to the claims, if the formations were obviously natural? Why not simply ignore the conspiracy theories? The attention NASA gave to refuting these claims suggested they took them seriously, or perhaps that they wanted to ensure these claims remained in the realm of debunked conspiracy theories rather than serious scientific questions. The next major mission came in 2009 with the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. This spacecraft carried even more advanced instruments and began what would become an ongoing, comprehensive survey of the entire lunar surface. The resolution was extraordinary. Individual boulders could be identified. Landing sites from the Apollo era were photographed in stunning detail, showing the descent stages of lunar modules and even the tracks left by astronauts' boots and rover wheels. The far side received particular attention. Thousands of images were captured and released to the public through NASA's Planetary Data System, a repository of space mission data accessible to researchers and the public. Scientists could now study the Moon's hidden hemisphere with clarity that would have been unimaginable during the Apollo era. Every crater, every mountain range, every unusual formation could be examined in detail. And yet the anomalies didn't disappear. If anything, they multiplied. Not because there was more evidence of artificial structures, but because higher resolution revealed just how complex and varied the lunar surface actually was. Every new image raised new questions. Why were certain crater patterns distributed the way they were? Statistical models predicted random distributions, but some regions showed clustering that seemed non-random. What caused the unusual reflectivity in specific regions? Some areas appeared brighter or darker than their composition should produce, suggesting unusual surface properties or hidden deposits. Why did some areas show signs of recent geological activity when the moon was supposedly geologically dead? Small landslides, boulder, movements, changes in surface albedo that suggested ongoing processes. Mainstream lunar scientists had explanations for all of these phenomena. The moon, they argued, was more dynamic than previously understood. There were ongoing processes driven by temperature variations, micrometeorite impacts, and interaction between solar radiation and surface materials. The moon wasn't completely dead, just extremely slowly active. But conspiracy theorists noticed something else. They noticed that certain images from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter were never released to the public database. NASA's image archive is extensive, containing hundreds of thousands of photographs taken over years of operation. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter alone has captured millions of images since its arrival in 2009. But researchers comparing the spacecraft's imaging schedule with the publicly available archive found gaps. Times when the orbiter was photographing specific far-side locations, but the resulting images weren't included in the public release. The agency explained that this was routine data management. Not every image was scientifically useful. Some were blurred due to spacecraft motion. Others were overexposed or underexposed. Some were redundant, showing the same terrain captured in previous passes. There was no point cluttering the archive with substandard images that provided no scientific value. This explanation made sense from an operational perspective. No organisation would release every piece of data they collected, especially when dealing with millions of images. Critics argued that this selective curation created opportunities for hiding significant findings. If something unexpected appeared in a photograph, it could simply be excluded from the public database. No explanation required, no questions asked. The image would remain in NASA's internal archives, accessible only to personnel with appropriate clearance. What made this argument more compelling was the fact that several nations now had their own lunar observation capabilities. China, India, Japan, and the European Space Agency had all sent missions to orbit or land on the moon. They were all capturing their own images, conducting their own analysis, and they were all being just as selective about what they released. China's Chang'e 2 orbiter, launched in 2010, captured high-resolution images of potential landing sites on both the near and far sides. The publicly released images showed impressive detail, but researchers noted that coverage of certain far-side regions was conspicuously absent from the public data. India's Chandrayaan missions provided chemical and mineralogical mapping, detecting water ice, and analysing surface composition. But like NASA and China, the Indian Space Research Organisation curated its data releases carefully. Japan's Kaguya mission, which orbited the Moon from 2007 to 2009, created detailed topographic maps and high-definition video footage. Some of this footage showed the far side in remarkable clarity. But again, not everything captured was released publicly. It suggested a pattern. An unspoken agreement among space agencies that certain information about the Moon, particularly the far side, should be carefully controlled. The question remained, what exactly were they controlling? The official answer was always the same. Mission data required careful validation before release. Scientific integrity demanded thorough review. Not everything captured was suitable for public distribution. All true, all reasonable, but insufficient to explain the specific patterns of what was released and what wasn't. Because if you mapped the gaps in coverage, if you identified which regions were photographed but not publicly released, an interesting pattern emerged. Many of the gaps corresponded to the same locations where earlier anomalies had been reported, the same formations that generated debate. during the Clementine mission. The same regions where amateur analysts had claimed to spot geometric structures. It could be coincidence. Those regions might simply be less scientifically interesting, and therefore images of them were deprioritized for public release, or it could be deliberate. Those regions might be more interesting than publicly acknowledged, and therefore images of them were being withheld pending further analysis. The truth, as always, was impossible to determine from the outside. Only people with access to the complete unfiltered datasets would know what had been observed but not released. And they weren't talking. Chapter 6. The Structure Debate. In the mid-2010s, a series of images from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter sparked intense online debate. Amateur researchers had discovered what appeared to be a cluster of geometric formations on the far side, in a region known as the Mare Orientale Basin near a crater named Marion. The formations consisted of several roughly rectangular shapes arranged in an apparently organised pattern. They were small, only a few metres across at most, but their regularity was striking. They appeared to cast shadows that suggested vertical height, not just surface markings or discolorations. The images spread quickly through conspiracy research communities on social media and specialised forums. Analysis was conducted by people with varying levels of expertise, from professional image analysts to enthusiastic amateurs with powerful computers and freely available image processing software. Measurements were taken. The dimensions of the rectangular shapes were calculated. The spacing between them was measured. The orientation relative to local terrain was determined. The consensus among amateur analysts was clear. These were artificial structures. Some proposed they were abandoned installations from an ancient lunar civilization. Others suggested they were artifacts left by extraterrestrial visitors. Few even theorized they were secret human constructions, placed there by classified missions that NASA wasn't acknowledging. The theories varied, but the underlying claim was consistent. These formations were not natural. NASA's response came swiftly, within days of the images gaining widespread attention online. A planetary geologist issued a public statement explaining that the formations were almost certainly boulders ejected during an impact event, which had coincidentally landed in a pattern that appeared organised. This was not unprecedented, the statement continued. Random distributions often created clusters that seemed non-random to human observers. Our brains are pattern recognition machines, evolved to spot threats and opportunities in complex environments. This makes us prone to seeing organisation where none exists. The impact that created the nearby crater would have ejected millions of rocks. Some would land close together. Some arrangements would appear geometric, purely by chance. Probability guaranteed it. The explanation was scientifically sound. Impact ejecta did indeed produce such patterns. Studies of impact events on Earth and other bodies had documented numerous cases of boulders landing in apparently organised arrangements. But skeptics noted that NASA's response came unusually quickly, as if the agency had been prepared for this exact discovery. As if they had known the images would eventually be analysed and had their rebuttal ready. Why would NASA have a prepared response unless they had already analysed these formations themselves and anticipated public interest? The agency never addressed this question directly. The statement was issued, the explanation was provided, and NASA moved on to other topics. But the formation in the Marion crater was just the beginning. More structures, or apparent structures, were discovered over the following years as amateur analysts systematically examined the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter image archive, not just in Marion crater but across the far side. Some appeared to be natural beyond reasonable doubt. Others were more ambiguous, and a few seemed genuinely difficult to explain through conventional geology. One particularly contentious example was a formation in the crater known as Tsiolkovsky, a large impact basin on the far side named after the Russian rocket pioneer. Orbital images showed what appeared to be a perfectly straight edge, several kilometres long, cutting across the crater floor. It looked like a wall or a ridge, but its linearity was extraordinary. Natural geological features rarely display such geometric precision over such distances. Planetary geologists examined the formation in detail. They proposed that it represented a fault line, where the lunar crust had fractured during the impact event that created Tsiolkovsky crater. The molten rock that later flooded the crater floor had cooled and contracted, creating linear fractures. This explanation was plausible. Fault lines could indeed be remarkably straight. Cooling lava could produce geometric patterns as it contracted and cracked. But the formation in Tsiolkovsky was straight to within the measurement resolution of the imaging system. No irregularities, no variations in width or orientation, just a perfectly linear feature stretching for kilometres. Statistical analysis suggested this level of linearity was extremely unlikely to occur naturally, though not impossible. Unlikely events happen frequently when you are observing millions of square kilometres of surface. Somewhere, a perfectly straight geological feature would exist purely by chance. The question was whether this specific feature was that statistical anomaly, or whether it represented something else. The debate intensified throughout the 2010s. Online communities dedicated to lunar anomalies grew in size and sophistication. Advanced image processing techniques were shared. Databases of unusual formations were compiled. Statistical analyses were performed to determine whether the distribution of anomalies was consistent with pure chance. Both sides claimed the evidence supported their position. Geologists insisted that everything observed could be explained through natural processes. Conspiracy researchers argued that the pattern of anomalies, taken collectively, suggested something beyond geology. Professional planetary scientists generally declined to engage with the conspiracy theories, viewing them as a waste of time and a distraction from legitimate research. This created a separation between mainstream academic study of the moon and the parallel analysis being conducted by amateur researchers. Some scientists did engage, writing articles and giving interviews explaining geological processes and the psychology of pattern recognition. They emphasized that skepticism was appropriate, but should be applied equally to all claims. Extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, and photographs of geometric-looking formations were not extraordinary evidence of artificial structures. What neither side could definitively prove was intentionality. Natural processes could create apparently artificial patterns. Impact ejecta could land in organised arrangements. Fault lines could be remarkably straight. Volcanic features could produce geometric shapes. But the question was whether that's what actually happened, or whether scientists were forcing natural explanations onto data that actually represented something else. This was the fundamental impasse. Without being able to visit these formations directly, to examine them up close, to analyse their composition and structure in detail, determining their true nature was impossible. Remote sensing had limits. Photographs could be interpreted multiple ways. Indirect evidence could support multiple conclusions. What was needed was direct investigation. Boots on the ground, or at least rovers capable of detailed analysis. But NASA's plans for future lunar exploration focused primarily on the near side, particularly the South Pole where water ice deposits offered potential resources for future bases. The far side remained a lower priority. China, however, had different plans. By the late 2010s, China's space program had made remarkable progress. They had landed missions on the near side, developed heavy-lift launch vehicles, and established a sophisticated space infrastructure that rivaled NASA's capabilities. And they had turned their attention to the far side, not with orbital missions or remote sensing, but with a landing mission designed to put instruments directly on the far side surface. This mission would change the far side debate in fundamental ways, because one of the world's superpowers was about to do something unprecedented. Something that would demonstrate capabilities and ambitions that suggested the moon was becoming a contested territory rather than a shared scientific resource. And they were going to do it with remarkably little advance notice to the international community. Chapter 7. The Strategic Value of Silence. Before we discuss what happened in the late 2010s, we need to understand why the far side of the moon has strategic value beyond simple geological curiosity. The far side is unique in our solar system. It's the only substantial body that is completely radio shielded from Earth by another massive object. When you're on the far side, our planet is literally blocked from view, hidden behind thousands of kilometres of lunar rock. Every radio transmission from Earth, every satellite signal, every bit of electromagnetic noise generated by our civilization is filtered out by that barrier. For radio astronomers, this is paradise. Earth's electromagnetic environment is incredibly noisy. Our civilization generates constant radio interference across virtually the entire spectrum. Cell towers pump out signals 24 hours a day. Satellites transmit television broadcasts, GPS signals, and communications data. Television and radio stations fill specific frequencies with programming. Radar systems sweep the sky continuously. Wi-Fi networks blanket populated areas. All of this creates a background noise that makes detecting faint cosmic signals nearly impossible from Earth's surface. Even radio telescopes in remote locations, far from cities and infrastructure, still operate in a contaminated electromagnetic environment. Techniques exist to filter out known interference sources. Software can subtract expected patterns. Observations can be timed to avoid passing satellites. But the noise floor is still enormously higher than it would be in a truly quiet environment. The far side of the moon offers perfect radio silence. No signals from Earth. No satellites overhead. No interference from human technology whatsoever. A telescope placed there could detect signals that would be completely invisible from Earth. It could listen to the faint whispers of the early universe, radiation from the cosmic dawn when the first stars ignited. It could detect exoplanet atmospheres through their radio emissions. It could potentially even detect artificial signals from other technological civilizations, if any exist in our galactic neighborhood. This has been understood since the early days of radio astronomy. Scientists have proposed far-side telescope arrays for decades. The scientific benefits would be revolutionary, opening entirely new windows on cosmic phenomena currently hidden by terrestrial interference. But there's another implication of that radio silence, one that has nothing to do with astronomy. If you wanted to conduct communications or surveillance operations that were completely undetectable from Earth, the far side of the moon would be the perfect location. You could operate transmitters, receivers, and data processing systems without any risk of monitoring from Earth-based facilities. Every transmission would be shielded by the moon itself. Every operation would be invisible to observation. During the Cold War, this strategic possibility was not lost on either superpower. Both the Soviet Union and the United States studied the feasibility of establishing far-side installations. Military planners considered the benefits of having communication relay stations that couldn't be jammed or monitored by adversaries. The technical challenges were enormous, particularly the need for relay satellites to maintain communication with Earth. Any far-side installation would be cut off from direct communication, requiring at least one satellite positioned where it could see both Earth and the far side simultaneously. The Soviets seriously considered this in the 1960s and 70s, proposing automated relay stations that could support military communications while remaining invisible to American monitoring. The Americans conducted similar studies, evaluating far-side locations for signals, intelligence operations. Nothing was built. The technical challenges were too great with the technology available at the time. The costs were astronomical. And as the Cold War ended, priorities shifted to other domains. But in recent years, interest in far-side infrastructure has resurged, and this time it's not theoretical. Multiple nations have announced plans for permanent far-side facilities. NASA has discussed potential locations for future bases as part of its Artemis program, which aims to establish sustained lunar presence. The European Space Agency has proposed collaborative projects involving far-side observations and potential installations. Russia, now operating with less resources than the Soviet Union commanded but still ambitious in space exploration, has outlined construction timelines for far-side facilities in partnership with other nations. But it was China that moved first. The Chinese space program, operating with less public scrutiny and more centralized decision-making than Western agencies, had been quietly developing far-side capabilities for years. They launched relay satellites, positioning them at gravitationally stable points where they could maintain constant contact with both Earth and the far side. They conducted detailed orbital surveys, mapping potential landing sites and analysing terrain for suitability. They identified specific regions of interest, though what made those regions interesting was never publicly explained in detail. And then, with relatively little advance notice to the international community, they landed a spacecraft on the far side. This was in early 2019. The mission was called Chang'e 4. It successfully touched down in the von Karman crater, a large impact basin within the even larger South Pole Aitken Basin, making China the first and only nation to achieve a soft landing on the lunar far side. The mission carried scientific instruments, including a radio telescope designed to conduct astronomical observations from the uniquely quiet environment. China presented this as a purely scientific endeavour, a contribution to human knowledge about the universe. International scientific organisations congratulated China on the achievement. Papers were published describing the mission's findings. The radio astronomy data was shared with international collaborators, but the strategic implications were impossible to ignore. By establishing a far-side presence, China had demonstrated technological capabilities that matched or exceeded those of NASA. They had proven they could maintain communications with a far-side facility through relay satellites, solving the technical challenge that had prevented earlier missions. They had created infrastructure that could potentially be expanded into a permanent installation. The Chang'e 4 lander and its accompanying rover were designed for extended operations, not just a brief demonstration. Most importantly, they had done it in a region that was effectively unobservable from Earth. The international response was muted in ways that suggested careful diplomatic consideration. NASA issued a statement acknowledging the achievement and expressing hope for international cooperation in future lunar exploration. The European Space Agency offered congratulations. Russia praised the mission as advancing scientific knowledge. But there was an underlying tension, a recognition that the rules of space exploration had shifted. Because here's what nobody said publicly. If China could land scientific instruments on the far side, they could land anything on the far side. Communications equipment, surveillance systems, research facilities whose true purpose remained classified. Even, theoretically, military assets, though the Outer Space Treaty prohibited such deployment. And nobody on Earth would ever know exactly what was there. This wasn't paranoia. It wasn't Cold War thinking inappropriately applied to modern cooperation. It was the inevitable logic of the far side's geography. Radio silence works both ways. It protects astronomical observations from Earth's interference, but it also shields whatever activities might be occurring there from Earth's observation. Any nation operating on the far side has complete information control. They decide what data to share. They determine what observations to release. They control the narrative about what they're doing and why. This creates strategic advantage regardless of what's actually being done. Even if operations are entirely peaceful and scientific, the perception of hidden capabilities creates leverage. Western space agencies began accelerating their own far-side plans. What had been long-term proposals discussed in planning documents and scientific conferences suddenly became near-term priorities with allocated funding. NASA announced partnerships with commercial space companies to develop far-side missions. International collaborations were formed, bringing together European, Japanese and Canadian agencies. Funding requests to government legislatures emphasised the strategic importance of lunar presence. The race for the far side had begun. But unlike the original space race of the 1960s, this one wasn't primarily about prestige or proving technological superiority. This one was about control, about establishing presence in a location that was, by its very nature, hidden from scrutiny, about ensuring that no single nation dominated access to the most strategically valuable real estate in the solar system. And some researchers began asking a different question. Why now? Why? After decades of proposals and studies and occasional missions, were multiple nations suddenly treating far-side infrastructure as an urgent priority? Was it simply the natural progression of space exploration? Technology had finally made far-side operations feasible and cost-effective. Commercial launch systems were reducing costs. International cooperation made ambitious projects possible. All of that was true, but it didn't fully explain the urgency. Or had something changed? Had some new information emerged that made the far side strategically critical in ways beyond radio astronomy and communications relay? The official answer was that technology and reduced costs had made far-side operations practical for the first time. Space agencies emphasised scientific benefits, particularly the unique environment for radio observations free from terrestrial interference. The real answer might be more complex, because if there was something on the far side, something discovered during earlier missions but kept classified, then establishing a permanent presence there wouldn't primarily be about astronomy or geological research. It would be about control, about investigation, about ensuring that whatever was there remained under human supervision and study, or perhaps about ensuring that whatever was there remained undiscovered by the public while governments determined how to handle the information. The strategic value of the far side, then, wouldn't just be its radio silence or its concealment from Earth-based observation. It would be whatever was already there, waiting to be fully understood. Chapter 8. Chang'e 4 and the Questions. Nobody asked. The Chang'e 4 landing should have been a massive international story. The first spacecraft on the far side of the moon. A historic achievement. Front-page news across the globe. It wasn't. Coverage was limited, technical and brief. Most major news outlets ran short pieces acknowledging the landing, then moved on to other topics within a day or two. The scientific community offered congratulations but seemed strangely restrained in their enthusiasm. This muted response was curious for several reasons. When China had landed Chang'e 3 on the near side in 2013, there had been significantly more international attention. That mission had been celebrated as a major step in China's space program, marking their arrival as a serious player in lunar exploration. Western media had covered it extensively, analysing what it meant for the future of space exploration and discussing the growing capabilities of China's space program. But Chang'e 4, the more technically challenging and historically significant mission, received far less fanfare. Some observers suggested this was political, Western media downplaying a Chinese achievement to avoid giving credit to a geopolitical rival. That explanation had some validity, particularly given the increasingly tense relationship between China and Western nations over trade, technology, and international influence. But it didn't account for the scientific community's restrained response. Scientists generally celebrate achievements regardless of national origin. Major discoveries and technical accomplishments are recognised because they advance human knowledge, not because of who achieved them. The first detection of gravitational waves was celebrated globally, even though it was primarily an American achievement. The discovery of the Higgs boson at CERN brought international acclaim despite being a European project. Science transcends national boundaries in ways that politics often doesn't. Yet the reaction to Chang'e 4 from planetary scientists, from space agencies in other countries, from the broader international community of researchers, was oddly subdued. It was as if the landing confirmed something rather than discovered something. As if people who knew what to expect were simply checking off a milestone rather than witnessing something new. China released data and images from the mission through established scientific channels. The terrain looked as expected based on orbital observations. The instruments functioned correctly, gathering data on composition, radiation environment, and other parameters. The relay satellite, positioned at a Lagrange point where gravitational forces from Earth and Moon balanced, maintained communications flawlessly. Signals travelled from the lander to the satellite, then from the satellite to Earth, with minimal delays and excellent data integrity. Everything was proceeding according to plan. But conspiracy researchers noticed something interesting about the Chinese data release schedule. Like NASA, like all space agencies, China's space program was selective about what information was made public and when. Images were released in batches, often weeks after they were captured. Scientific data went through extensive review before publication in academic journals. This was presented as normal scientific procedure. Data needed to be validated, calibrated against known standards, and properly documented before release. Rushing to publish raw data could lead to misinterpretations, false conclusions, and errors that would undermine scientific credibility. All true, all reasonable, all consistent with standard practice across international space agencies. Yet some patterns emerged that seemed unusual, even accounting for normal caution. Certain images from Chang'e 4 showed landscape features that appeared inconsistent with surrounding terrain. Unusual brightness variations that didn't match the expected photometric properties of lunar regolith. Shadows that didn't quite align with the expected solar angles given the known time and location. Small details that amateur analysts poring over every released image flagged as potentially significant. Chinese space officials addressed these observations with the same explanations NASA had used for decades. Lighting effects created illusions. Camera artifacts from sensor noise or compression algorithms produced apparent anomalies. Natural geological variations appeared unusual in photographs, but were perfectly ordinary in context. The explanations were scientifically valid. Every claimed anomaly had a prosaic explanation that fit within, understood physics and geology. But the pattern of anomalies continued, and more intriguing were reports that never made it into official channels. Rumours circulated among space industry personnel, shared in private communications and informal discussions at conferences, about Chinese scientists being surprised by some of the Chang'e 4 data. Not shocked. Not witnessing anything that contradicted fundamental understanding of lunar science. Just small discrepancies that didn't quite match expectations. These were second-hand accounts, third-hand in some cases, impossible to verify. Someone knew someone who worked with someone at the Chinese Academy of Sciences who had mentioned that certain measurements were unexpected, but they suggested that something about the far-side environment wasn't matching theoretical models, not dramatically, not obviously, just enough to be noticeable to people who knew what the measurements should show. One persistent rumour involved electromagnetic, readings from the lander's instruments. The background radiation environment was reportedly showing fluctuations that didn't align with solar activity or known sources. Not constant, not regular, but occasional spikes or variations that defied easy explanation. Another rumour mentioned that some of the Chang'e 4 rover's photographs, never publicly released, showed features in nearby terrain that Chinese researchers were still attempting to explain. Natural formations, almost certainly, but with characteristics that didn't quite fit established categories. None of this rose to the level of confirmed fact. No documents were leaked, no whistleblowers came forward with evidence. The claims remained in the realm of unverified speculation, but they aligned with a pattern that had been developing for decades. A pattern of space agencies being more interested in the far side than their public statements suggested. Of careful control over what information reached public awareness. Of scientific findings being processed through multiple layers of review before release. China announced plans for additional far-side missions. Chang'e 5 would focus on sample return from the near side, but future missions would revisit the far side with more advanced instruments. A permanent far-side research station was proposed, with construction potentially beginning within the next decade. International cooperation was invited, with China offering to share resources and coordinate efforts with other space agencies. This was presented as a magnanimous gesture, an attempt to make lunar exploration a global endeavour rather than a national competition. But the offer came with conditions. Partner nations would need to coordinate their activities with Chinese mission control. Data sharing would be negotiated on a case-by-case basis. Access to Chinese far-side infrastructure would be granted according to terms Beijing would determine. In other words, China was establishing itself as the gatekeeper to far-side access. The international response to these announcements was telling. NASA accelerated its own far-side proposals, seeking funding for missions that could operate independently of Chinese infrastructure. Russia began discussing joint missions with China, recognizing that partnership might offer better access than competition. Private space companies, particularly American ones, started offering far-side delivery services to whoever would pay, seeing a business opportunity in nations wanting independent access. Everyone wanted a presence there. This rush seemed disproportionate to the stated scientific benefits. Yes, far-side radio astronomy was valuable. Yes, geological research could advance our understanding of lunar formation and evolution. Yes, the unique environment offered opportunities for certain types of experiments. But the level of investment being proposed, the speed with which plans were being developed, exceeded what those benefits alone would justify, unless there was another reason. unless the far side offered something beyond scientific discovery, something strategic, something that governments understood but weren't publicly discussing, or perhaps something that had already been discovered but remained classified. By the time Chang'e 4 completed its primary mission and entered extended operations, continuing to function far beyond its designed lifespan, the far side had transformed from an astronomical curiosity into a geopolitical priority. And that transformation happened with surprising speed and remarkable global coordination, almost as if every major space agency had received the same briefing, almost as if they all knew something that justified treating the far side as strategically critical. But what exactly they knew remained carefully unstated. The scientific papers published from Chang'e 4, data focused on composition analysis, radiation measurements, and geological observations, all legitimate science, all contributing to human knowledge. But conspicuously absent from these publications was any discussion of anomalies, unexpected findings, or observations that didn't fit existing models, which could mean there were no such observations, or it could mean they were being handled through other channels that didn't involve public scientific literature and open academic discourse. Chapter 9. The Signal Hypothesis. Among the various conspiracy theories about the far side, one has gained particular traction in recent years. It doesn't claim massive alien bases or crashed spacecraft. It doesn't require believing in impossible secret construction projects or elaborate cover-ups involving thousands of people. It simply suggests that there might be something on the far side that's transmitting a signal. The theory evolved from analysis of the various anomalies we've discussed throughout this investigation. The strange sounds reported by Apollo astronauts during far-side passes, the geometric formations visible in orbital images, the unusual electromagnetic readings hinted at in unverified reports, and most significantly, the coordinated international interest in establishing far-side infrastructure. The hypothesis is straightforward. At some point during lunar observation missions, sensors detected an artificial signal emanating from the far side. Not a message intended for humanity, not an attempt at communication, but rather an automated transmission. Something old, something that had been broadcasting for a very long time, possibly millions of years. This would explain several puzzling aspects of far-side research that we've examined. First, it would explain why certain data from early missions remained classified far longer than national security concerns would justify. A signal detection would be exactly the kind of discovery that governments would classify immediately. Not because it was dangerous necessarily, but because they needed time to understand it before causing potential public panic or religious upheaval. Second, it would explain the sudden international urgency about far-side infrastructure that emerged in the 2010s. If a signal existed, every major nation would want independent confirmation. They would want their own instruments on the far side, free from reliance on other nations' data or interpretations. The race wouldn't be about claiming territory, which is prohibited by international treaty anyway. It would be about verification, about ensuring your nation had first-hand knowledge rather than depending on what others chose to share. Third, it would explain the restraint in public announcements. If multiple agencies had detected the same signal independently, but couldn't explain its origin or determine its meaning, they would face an impossible communication problem. How do you tell the public that something artificial exists on the moon without knowing what it is, where it came from, how old it is, or what it means? Do you announce it immediately, triggering global speculation and possible panic? Do you wait until you understand more, risking accusations of cover-up if the information leaks? Do you coordinate with other nations first, creating delays and complications? The safest answer, from a bureaucratic perspective, would be to say nothing, at least until you understand more, at least until you can frame the discovery in ways that minimize disruption. The signal hypothesis gained support from an unlikely source, whistleblower testimony. In the early 2020s, a former NASA contractor came forward, claiming to have worked on signal analysis from far-side observations. His name was never widely publicized, and he spoke primarily through intermediary researchers, rather than directly to media. His account was detailed and technically sophisticated. He described detection methodology, frequency ranges, analysis protocols and data processing techniques in ways that suggested genuine familiarity with NASA's operations. According to his testimony, an anomalous signal had been detected by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter during routine radio environment mapping in the late 2010s. The spacecraft carried instruments designed to measure the electromagnetic environment around the Moon, characterizing natural radio emissions and mapping variations in the magnetic field. During a pass over a specific region of the far side, the instruments detected something unexpected, a faint but distinct radio emission that didn't match any natural source. The signal was extremely weak, barely above the detection threshold. It was periodic, repeating with a consistent interval, and it originated from a specific location on the surface, not from space or from any known spacecraft. The contractor claimed that when this detection was reported to senior NASA personnel, an immediate classification was imposed. The data was segregated from routine observations. Analysis was restricted to personnel with appropriate security clearances, and no mention was made in public science releases from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter mission. Further observations were conducted, according to his account, using different instruments and from different orbital positions. The signal remained detectable, consistent in its properties, originating from the same location. Analysis determined it was not interference from spacecraft systems, it was not reflection or scattering from Earth-based transmissions, it was not any known natural phenomenon produced by solar radiation interacting with lunar materials. It appeared to be artificial, generated by technology, modulated in ways that suggested information content, though the modulation scheme was unlike anything in human telecommunications. NASA immediately denied these claims when they began circulating online. The contractor was dismissed as disgruntled, possibly fabricating the story for attention or financial gain from appearances at conferences and in documentaries. No corroborating evidence was provided by the contractor. No documents were leaked. No other personnel came forward to support his account. It remained a single source making extraordinary claims without extraordinary evidence. But some details in his testimony were oddly specific and verifiable. He described technical procedures for signal processing that matched NASA's known methods. He mentioned specific dates for orbital passes that aligned with known Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter activities. He discussed internal organizational structures and communication protocols in ways that suggested insider knowledge. Most importantly, he claimed that the signal had characteristics suggesting it wasn't natural. It showed amplitude modulation patterns. It had spectral structure indicating intentional frequency selection. And it appeared to be repeating with a period that didn't match any known astronomical or geological cycle. If true, this would be the most significant discovery in human history. Proof that artificial constructs existed beyond Earth, created by non-human intelligence. Evidence that we weren't alone in the universe, or at least that we hadn't been alone in the past. But proof was precisely what was lacking. The contractor provided no documents, no recordings, no data files, no physical evidence of any kind. His claims rested entirely on personal testimony, and while his technical knowledge seemed legitimate, that didn't prove his specific claims about signal detection were accurate. He could have worked on signal processing for NASA, giving him authentic knowledge of procedures, while fabricating the story about an anomalous detection. Alternatively, he could be misremembering or misinterpreting events from years earlier, conflating routine detections of interference with something more exotic. Or, of course, he could be telling the truth about something that actually happened, but was successfully kept classified. The story faded from mainstream attention after the initial wave of interest. News cycles moved on. The contractor gave a few more interviews, then largely disappeared from public view. But in conspiracy research communities, the signal hypothesis became the dominant explanation for far-side secrecy. It fit the pattern of evidence better than other theories. It didn't require believing in massive construction projects that would leave obvious traces. It didn't depend on crashed spacecraft or alien bases that should be visible in high-resolution images. It only required accepting that automated technology, far older than human civilization, might exist in our solar system, that some ancient intelligence had placed monitoring equipment or navigational beacons or scientific instruments on the Moon, and they were still functioning millions or billions of years later. This was actually more plausible than many alternatives. Physics allowed for such longevity. Engineering could achieve it. We ourselves were building spacecraft designed to function for centuries, sending probes beyond the solar system that would operate long after human civilization might have fallen. If we could do it with primitive 21st century technology, what might a truly advanced civilization achieve? The hypothesis suggested that the signal wasn't a message directed at Earth. It was more like a beacon, an automated system performing some function, broadcasting into space, perhaps for millions of years, waiting for something. Or perhaps simply transmitting because that's what it was designed to do, long after its creators disappeared from the universe. This would explain why there was no obvious attempt at communication. This signal wasn't trying to contact us. We happened to develop the technology to detect it, but it wasn't intended for us specifically. Some versions of the theory went further, suggesting the signal might be a coordinate marker. WITI, a reference point for navigation. Something that would allow its creators to locate our moon from vast distances across interstellar or even intergalactic space. Advanced civilizations might seed galaxies with such beacons, creating a navigation network that persisted across cosmic timescales. Our moon might simply be one node in a vast system we were only beginning to detect. Others proposed it might be a monitoring station. Automated sensors watching for signs of technological civilization, designed to activate or transmit specific messages when intelligent life emerged on nearby planets. Maybe it had been silent for billions of years, waiting patiently, and only began transmitting when Earth's electromagnetic emissions indicated we had developed radio technology. These elaborations were purely speculative, extending beyond any evidence into imaginative scenarios. But the core signal hypothesis remained frustratingly plausible. It explained the known facts without requiring impossible claims. It accounted for government secrecy without demanding massive conspiracies. It suggested a discovery that would justify classification without requiring malicious intent or cover-up. And most disturbingly, it suggested that we might be living in a universe where ancient technology outlives its creators, continuing to function long after the civilizations that built it have vanished into cosmic history. The question wasn't whether such technology could exist. Physics permitted it. Engineering could achieve it. The question was whether it actually did exist on the far side of our moon, and whether the recent race to establish permanent far-side infrastructure was really about astronomy and geological research, or about investigating something that had already been found but wasn't yet understood, something that governments had decided the public wasn't ready to know about, at least not yet. Chapter 10. The Logic of Silence. Let's engage in a thought experiment. Assume, for the sake of argument, that something artificial exists on the far side of the moon. Not necessarily a signal broadcasting into space, not necessarily any specific thing, just something that can't be explained through natural geological processes. How would governments respond? The instinctive assumption might be immediate public disclosure. A discovery of that magnitude would be impossible to keep secret, the reasoning goes. Too many people would be involved. Too many nations would have independent confirmation. Someone would leak the information. But that assumption might be wrong, and understanding why requires thinking through the actual decision-making process that would occur. Consider what would happen if multiple space agencies independently detected something artificial on the far side. Each would immediately classify the finding, not because of malicious intent or desire to deceive the public, but because that's standard protocol for significant national security information. Anything unprecedented, anything with potential strategic implications, gets classified automatically while assessment occurs. Each agency would then face a critical decision: confirm with other agencies or investigate independently. Confirmation would require sharing classified data across international boundaries. It would mean admitting the discovery to geopolitical rivals. It would create immediate pressure for coordinated public disclosure before any single nation fully understood what they'd found. Independent investigation would allow each nation to control the narrative, to develop their own understanding before sharing information. But it would also create a prisoner's dilemma situation. Everyone knows the others probably detected the same thing, but nobody wants to be the first to publicly acknowledge it. Nobody wants to create global panic or disruption before understanding the full implications. The rational choice from each individual nation's perspective becomes coordinated silence. Not through explicit conspiracy or formal agreement, but through parallel decision-making by independent bureaucracies all following the same logic. Don't disclose until you understand. Don't admit what you know until others do. Don't create public upheaval over something you can't fully explain. This would explain several observable patterns in how space agencies have behaved regarding the far side. It would explain why multiple nations are racing to establish far-side infrastructure without clearly articulating why it's suddenly so urgent. They're all trying to get their own assets in position to investigate, without revealing that there's something specific to investigate. Each agency can claim they're pursuing normal scientific research, studying the unique environment, establishing presence for future exploration. All true statements that don't reveal the underlying motivation. It would explain the muted public response to significant far-side missions like Chang'e 4. If space agencies know there's something genuinely important about the far side, celebrating each mission becomes awkward. Too much enthusiasm might prompt journalists to ask questions about why this particular region is receiving so much attention. Better to downplay significance, treat each mission as routine, avoid drawing attention to patterns. It would explain the careful curation of data releases we've discussed. Images and measurements would be reviewed not just for scientific accuracy, but for what they might inadvertently reveal. Anything ambiguous would be withheld pending further analysis. Anything that might generate public questions would be classified. Better to control information flow than deal with premature disclosure. Most importantly, it would explain why there's been no explicit denial of far-side anomalies despite widespread public speculation. NASA and other agencies could easily make definitive statements. We have thoroughly investigated the far side and found no evidence of artificial structures, signals, or anything that cannot be explained through natural processes. They don't say this. They address specific claims individually, debunking particular photographs or refuting specific